public session. Is that agreed? Agreed. We have received apologies from Deputy Louise O'Reilly, and Deputy Jonathan O'Brien is going to substitute for her this morning.
Chambers arrives, she's going to substitute for Deputy Murphy O'Mahony, if that's acceptable.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I would like to welcome you, Minister, Minister Simon Harris, and also Jim Breslin, Secretary-General of the Department of Health, and Colm Desmond, Assistant Secretary, to our meeting this morning. The purpose of today's meeting is to consider the further revised estimates for 2019 for Vote 38 of the Department of Health, which was referred by the Dáil to the Select Committee on Health on the 20th of February 2019. Can I now ask you, Minister Harris, to make your opening statement?
Thank you so much, Chairman. I don't have a sub, so thank you very much for having me here this morning. I'm delighted to be back at this Select Committee, and I very much look forward to taking the opportunity of addressing the Select Committee on the topic that this committee meeting is indeed about, which is the revised estimates for 2019 for my department, otherwise known as Vote 38. I note that the committee wishes to consider the estimate on a programme-by-programme basis, but as you, Chair, will be well aware, unlike other votes, the health vote is not configured along programme lines, as my department continues to work towards the development of programme budgeting and changing the structure of the health votes to reflect this. I also note and indeed welcome the fact that the committee wishes to particularly focus on the financial allocations for implementation of the provisions of Swanick report and indeed capital allocations for our hospitals. In that context, it's worth pointing out that 2019 was the highest investment ever in our health services, and it's also, importantly, the first year that the Health Service Executive's National Service Plan is framed through the lens of the Swanick implementation strategy. This strategy provides the framework within which a system-wide reform programme for the health system will be advanced, and it focuses on establishing the building blocks for a significant shift in the way in which our health services are delivered in Ireland, looking to see what more can be done in the community. So this idea of everything having to be channelled through the hospital structure is no longer the situation. The National Service Plan sets out further details on how the totality of health resources, including the significant additional provision being made available by government, will be used to advance Sláintec's objectives in 2019. In addition, the welcome increases in the health capital budget over the period to 2021 will allow progress on key developments such as our new National Children's Hospital, which I'm sure we'll discuss, the National Forensic Mental Hospital, and continued improvements in radiation oncology infrastructure in Dublin, Cork and Galway, which becomes all the more pressing and important when you see the National Cancer Registry of Ireland's report of this week. The programme of development of new and refurbished primary care units and community nursing units throughout the country will continue to be rolled out, and additional funding over this period will also be utilised to deliver additional acute and residential care beds and progress work on key Sláinte care projects. The gross provision for the health vote in 2018 was 15.977 billion, comprising 15.464 billion current expenditure and 513 million capital expenditure. This represents the gross funding position for both the Department of Health and the Health Service Executive, and includes additional funding of €645 million granted by means of a supplementary estimate. The additional gross funding requirement comprises 20 million towards capital works and 625 million towards overspends in current expenditure, which I believe we've discussed before. In framing the 2019 budget, the Oireachtas allocated significant further additional exchequer funding for the health sector. In 2019, gross health funding is €17.032 billion, comprising 16.365 billion in current expenditure and 667 million in capital. This represents an increase of €901 million on the 2008 current expenditure budget and €154 million on capital expenditure, and recognises our commitment to providing a health service that seeks to improve the health and well-being of the people of Ireland. It's no surprise to any member of this committee, or indeed to anybody in our country, that the issue of health funding is a major policy challenge, not just in Ireland but indeed internationally. Despite welcome increases over recent years, the need for effective financial management does remain crucial, as the health service deals with a larger and an older population, with more acute and social care requirements, and increased demand for new and existing drugs, and the rising cost of health technology. The costs associated with these service pressures will increasingly need to be managed not solely through annual increased exchequer allocations, but also through doing things better, reforming our health service, productivity, efficiencies and value from within the funding base. Demographic pressures, including a rise in chronic disease and ageing populations, which is a good thing, the ageing populations piece, are major challenges to health funding internationally. The additional funding secured over recent years provides a substantial basis for the health service to maximise the level and quality of service delivery, whilst also implementing the Sláinte Care programme. I now wish to address a number of issues which I understand the committee in its letter to me identified as being of specific interest. In relation to the new Children's Hospital, members will be aware that the independent comprehensive review of the escalation in cost of the new Children's Hospital, the contributory factors and the associated responsibilities has now been completed. It was brought to government yesterday and has now been published. I want to begin by very clearly welcoming the report's findings that the government's decision in December 2018 to continue with this project based on the advice available at the time was the correct decision. It states that any alternative course of action would have resulted in significant delay, further increased costs and indeed the possibility that the hospital would not be built. So I received much advice and indeed political charges from around these houses after the cost escalation became clear that I should retender the project, that I should pause the project, that I should move the project. The PwC report, independent financial auditors have found that the appropriate decision to make was to proceed with the project. The report addresses in detail the flow of information on the issue of cost escalation and confirms the information already in the public domain in relation to communications with my department. And I think that's important too, that all of the documentation that PwC had access to clearly aligns with the published documents that I made available to this committee before. But the report does point out significant areas of weakness that need to be addressed and need to be strengthened to support this project to successful completion, but also very significant learning for capital projects in general. We're back in an era of investing in capital projects. There'll be many big capital projects, not just in the area of health, and there's some very important learnings in this report. While it's important that we retain the experience and expertise gained over the last number of years by those involved in progressing the new Children's Hospital, based on the report's findings, it's very clear that I will need to, and I will be, strengthening the capability and capacity of this resource where necessary to further support the planning and the execution of the phase of this project. I've already commenced this process, as you'll be aware, Chair, with the appointment of a new chairperson of the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board, Mr. Fred Barry, a man with a lot of experience in delivering capital projects. And I intend to now consider, in line with the government decision of yesterday, the report's findings and recommendations in detail with my colleague, the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform, Pascal Donoghue, with both our departments, with the HSE and with Mr. Barry. And I will revert to government next month, setting out a considered response to the report and an implementation plan. I do believe the recommendations provide a firm basis to improve the management of project delivery, and we will comprehensively address the recommendations of the PwC report, and in doing so successfully meet the needs of the children of Ireland for many years to come. What I don't intend to do today is give a knee-jerk response. There's a reason that the government asked and decided indeed that we'd take 4 weeks to come back with an implementation plan, but I've no doubt there's a role for this committee to be determined by you, Chairman, in terms of ensuring a comprehensive implementation plan. I look forward to working with you in that regard. I do think we have to take very seriously, though, some of the clear indications in the report in relation to the professional information given to the National Development Board. Page 4 of the report is very clear in relation to material errors and a peculiar way of doing business in terms of arriving at some figures, and I think that's going to cause significant need for reflection, and I intend to meet in the coming days with the new chair of the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board to ask for his response and the response of his board to those findings as well. But as I have said many times before, and I'll reiterate here again today, children and young people of Ireland have been waiting far too long for a modern healthcare facility and for this new Children's Hospital. I know everyone says, Sir Minister, everyone says that, well, actually there's a lot of people who thought we should pause it or retender it or move it at this late stage. We're not going to do that. The outpatient and urgent care centre at Connolly is scheduled to open this summer. In fact, I'll be meeting Children's Health Ireland this afternoon. The Connolly part of this hospital project will actually be handed over to the state this month, and we'll start delivering real service improvements for children this year as well. There obviously are implications for the Children's Hospital overrun. We've discussed this before, of that there is no doubt. An additional €99 million is required for the project in 2019, and the government decided that 24 million of this additional funding will be provided from within the €667 million allocation, with the balance of the 75 million to be met by rescheduling capital allocations in other departments as well. And finally, Chairman, you asked me to comment on the issue in the letter regarding the Sláinte Care implementation strategy. So this, as you know, was published in August 2018. Except it took us a degree of time to get to this point, but we now have a very clear implementation strategy. Budget 2019 included €206 million for specific new initiatives associated with the Sláinte Care implementation strategy, including negotiating a new GP contract, which you and I discuss very regularly, but I'm pleased to say we've now made significant progress, welcomed by both the IMO and the NAGP, in terms of investment in general practice. We have, of course, more to do, and I'm sure you'll have views in relation to that, but for the very first time, a large-scale structured chronic disease management programme, ensuring that patients with diabetes, with asthma, with COPD and with cardiovascular disease can be treated in their community. We'll roll out that programme over the next 4 years, starting in 2020. Ultimately, will benefit 400,000 patients. And these are patients that today are going to our hospitals, to our outpatient clinics, extending free GP care to under 12s, but on a phased and careful basis, learning the lessons perhaps of the under 6s. I would propose that we go to under 8s next year, and we need to negotiate a fee in that regard through the IMO. But crucially, and I know a big bugbearer for GPs, and I heard this very, very clearly, I can assure you, over the last number of years, was a legitimate concern, in my view, that general practice had, that it wasn't currently sustainable, that as a result of the FEMPI cuts and the €120 million taken out by successive governments, that bit's forgotten, by successive governments, the general practice had been left in a difficult position. We have now worked out a way of moving beyond that, restoring the equivalent level of funding plus more, but in return, our GPs very helpfully are offering to reform and to modernise and to work with us on important initiatives like e-health, medicines management, accurate waiting lists, virtual clinics. So I think we have what is a fair and balanced deal, but crucially we have one that will help deliver Sláinte Care as well. You've also seen the further rollout of national strategies in the area of maternity, trauma, cancer and drugs, and a €20 million Sláinte Care integration fund, where we're inviting people around the country, organisations, both the health service itself, but also voluntary organisations, to pitch their ideas as to how they can help deliver Sláinte Care. I launched that fund on the 22nd of March, and we will allocate that funding in May. I expect to be back here at this committee for a very detailed discussion about geo-alignment. I am determined to follow the recommendations which you co-authored, Chair, in relation to how we reform the structures of the health service. Very clear advice to me in the Sláinte Care report about what are called RICOs. I don't like the name, being quite honest, but I know what the purpose is. The idea of, over time, merging our community health organisations and our hospital groups, dividing our country based on a population health approach rather than any other approach, and reducing the bureaucracy and putting in regional oversight structures. I intend to move on that this summer. And I intend to come back to this committee to discuss that further with you at an appropriate time. So in conclusion, we've seen a significant increase in funding for the health services. We are continuing, though, to deal with the growing and ageing population, more acute health and social care requirements, and an increased demand for new and existing drugs. I do believe Sláinte Care gives us a roadmap to support the delivery of high-quality care to our citizens. And as I say, 2019 is really the first year of that roadmap, and the first year that our service plan is developed based on the new Sláinte Care implementation strategy. I look forward to your questions.
Minister, very much for your opening statement. I'm now going to open the discussion to members, and the first member is Deputy Stephen Donnelly.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, you're very welcome. There's a lot of issues we'd like to discuss, or certainly I'd like to discuss, including the Children's Hospital and provisioning therein, Sláinte Care for this year, the very urgent issues of recruitment and retention. As we'll all be aware, cervical check is a big and pressing issue at the moment, and when we got the revised estimates, one of the things I did was search through them for allocations for cervical check. We have 80,000 women waiting up to 8 months for test results. We have the indefinite delay of the HPV test, and I was expecting to see an additional provision or a carry forward from last year to account for the fact that additional cytology is required to move through this very urgent backlog, and indeed to provide colposcopy, additional colposcopy capacity when the backlog moves through cytology, because obviously there will be increased referrals to consultant doctors. And I'd like to start on the genesis of this backlog and the fact that I think we do need to provision for it financially this year. The HSC says that 2/3 of the backlog and the delay to the HPV test are due to the blanket offer of the free out-of-cycle smear test for any woman who wanted one. You stated recently in a PQ response to me that neither you nor your officials received any advice against such a decision before the announcement was made. In the last 2 weeks, The committee has evidence from Dr. Gráinne Flannelly, including that such an offer would fundamentally undermine the programme.
We are discussing the estimates, and
That's
it's
right.
quite legitimate that you would speak about estimates in relation to cervical check, but we do need to concentrate on the estimates rather than on the issue of advice.
Yes, we do, Chair. But what I want to explore in the opening is the decisions and the information that the committee has that has led to this need for provisioning to deal with the backlog, if I may.
I'm very happy to answer.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Dr. Gráinne Flannelly, as you'll be aware, Minister, submitted to the committee recently that actually advice was offered and received by the department that the offer would fundamentally undermine the programme, which suggests that your PQ response to me is not true. You stated that any advice you received was significantly after the decision, but evidence from Tony O'Brien that he asked you to walk the decision back the following day suggests that what you say there was not true. You stated that the Chief Medical Officer supported your decision, but evidence referred to by Susan Mitchell in the Sunday Business Post just 3 days ago that the Chief Medical Officer supported a much more targeted approach suggests that this is not true. The committee, Minister, has mounting evidence from multiple sources that advice against what you announced was in fact given before the announcement, at a minimum to a principal officer in your department, immediately after your announcement by email from the National Screening Service and by the DG of the HSE, and repeatedly in the months after your announcement, and that in fact you ignored all of that advice, and that this has led to the delays in testing and the introduction of the HPV test. Now, given that we need to provision for this, and given that there don't appear to be any provisions in here, would you like at this stage, Minister, to correct the Dáil record? Because it is difficult not to conclude, given the evidence that the committee has received, other than that the committee has been, and indeed the Dáil has been, repeatedly misled on this decision to offer the free out-of-cycle test, and indeed that we now need to provision for that this year. I just wonder, would you like to take the opportunity to correct the Dáil record on that issue?
No, I'd like to take the opportunity to correct you, Deputy Donnelly, because I've been listening to these false political charges now for quite a period of time. I've also been listening to the patient representatives, be they Vicky Phelan, Stephen Teeper, Lorraine Walsh, all asking this committee would they like to actually focus more on the present for now, for more important issues, to stop focusing on the past, to stop playing politics with the issue. And I've also been listening to people that are regularly quoted to this committee as experts in relation to general practice, like the President of the National Association of General Practitioners, saying, and I quote as recently as the 8th of April, "I'd be the first to criticise Simon Harris, that's true, but I personally believe he made this decision in the belief that it was the right thing to do for the situation at the time. I was in cervical check headquarters as the phones were hopping with patients looking for repeat smears. At that stage, women had only two options: pay for a smear privately at €120 a year, perhaps something a TD could afford to do, or do nothing. And many women were paying privately, so there was a two-tier system developing. GPs were put in an impossible position as women requested repeat smears. No woman was refused a smear, and if a woman was refused a smear, I think confidence in cervical check would have dwindled further." So I think, and I'd like a little bit of time on this, Chair, if you don't mind, because you obviously held an entire meeting last week on it where political charges were levelled, and I obviously wasn't present or invited to attend on that occasion. So I made the decision, I stand over the decision. I made the decision consistent with the advice of my Chief Medical Officer, and there's been no evidence produced to suggest that I didn't. In fact, what there has been is a letter to the Ceann Comhairle in February in response to your party leaders' assertions from my department, not from me, but from my department, saying, in fact, the Minister's decision and announcement on the 28th of April was consistent with advice received from his officials. And the advice of the Chief Medical Officer to the Minister was reflected in the press statement in the issue of the 28th of April. So let me deal with the two issues, that, and then I'll deal with the issue of the cervical check screening service advice. So I worked hand in glove with the Chief Medical Officer, who showed extraordinary leadership at a time when many clinicians walked off the pitch. Dr. Tony Holohan worked night and day on this. In fact, you even saw my text messages in the newspaper to show how much contact we had released through FOI. Dr. Tony Holohan's advice to me, and this has been confirmed by my department in writing to the Ceann Comhairle and by me in parliamentary questions to you and your leader in February and March, was that this was an appropriate thing to do. Absolutely an appropriate thing to do where a GP believed it to be done. Of that, there was no difference. We can quote my tweets and try to reduce this to a tweet. We can quote other people's tweets if we want as well. My tweet said, and my department also tweeted, by the way, they're at it as well, departments tweet these days too. But I said details would follow. And about 20 minutes later, a press statement followed from my department. So there was no difference in opinion between my chief medical officer, my senior officials, or myself, who all believed at the time of a major public health crisis that this was the appropriate thing to do. We were hearing directly from GPs and directly from women. I'm sure you were too. My inbox was full of constituents wanting to know, could I have a repeat smear? And doctors wanted to know as well. Now, it is fair to say, Deputy Donnelly, that at that stage, I couldn't have known, you couldn't have known, no one could have known how long that period of reassurance would have been for. So we all expected, and we all worked together in fairness, and I acknowledge that, on the terms of reference for the Scally report. We expected the Scally report to come back, I think, in June. This decision was made at the end of April. When the Scally report came back, it did provide significant reassurance, but because of the very comprehensive nature of Dr. Scally's report, it didn't actually come back till September. So there's no doubt the window of worry and concern was longer than any of us would have liked. In relation to the issue of the cervical check management and what advice they offered. So as far back as the 12th of March 2019, I told you in a parliamentary question that neither I nor my officials received advice that recommended against these tests in advance of the decision. But I did also say in that parliamentary question, the Taoiseach also said on the record of the Dáil, I said subsequent to the decision on foot of telephone contact by my department, the National Screening Service did raise a number of concerns, and following the announcement, the Screening Service set out these concerns in an email to my department. These concerns related to an uncertainty about cost, volume, impact on turnaround times, impact on the perception of the programme's accuracy, challenges with processing GP payments, and the potential difficulty in ceasing the arrangements in due course. Delighted to give you the email this morning, no issue whatsoever to do that. The email came in at 17:59 after the decision had been made. The email also says, though, it's understood that we take direction from the department. I make policy decisions. I own this decision. I believe it was the right thing to do, and I have 110,000 reasons to believe it's the right thing to do, because 110,000 women saw their GP in seeking reassurance. Only 57,000 of them actually opted for the repeat smear, which shows GPs did their job. I don't believe any woman needed to be directed by me as to what the appropriate thing to do for her healthcare was. But what I do believe she needed from me was not to be insulted by saying they had to put their hand in their pocket in relation to this situation. So the advice was not received by my department in advance of the decision. The chronology is very straightforward. We make the decision as a department. I made the decision. I own the decision. I'll stand over the decision, because you wouldn't do this in normal times, but they were exceptional times. That decision was then conveyed to the Screening Service. Here is what we are doing. And the Screening Service did outline some of the risks after the decision was made. And of course there were some risks, but all of these risks were readily identifiable. The risk how would your GP gets paid was one risk. We sorted that out. The risk that it could potentially undermine further confidence in the programme. I thought that was somewhat of an ironic risk, considering the way in which cervical check had been managed and the audit had been handled and Vicky Phelan had been treated, undermined the confidence in the programme as well. And it did talk about the additional impact that this would have on lab turnaround times. But this was inevitable, Deputy Donnelly. I mean, I've spoken to so many women, as I'm sure you have. They were going for repeat smears anyway. People wanted that assurance. Women we all know in our own lives, in our own community, until the state could say our screening service is safe, they were seeking that. So I did not mislead the Dáil. I took this decision for good reasons. I took this decision after hearing from GPs, after hearing from women, consistent with the advice of my Chief Medical Officer and my senior department officials, confirmed in writing to the Ceann Comhairle of this House as far back as February. I have never hidden from the fact that after the decision was made, there was concerns expressed, and indeed happy to. I've outlined them already before in email, in the content of them in PQs, but I'm happy to give you a physical copy, and I have them here, Chair, to circulate of the email as well. So I genuinely, I've said I made mistakes during cervical check, no doubt about it. Fortunately, others haven't. Dr. Scally talked about the frenzied political and media environment. I think I'm possibly the only person involved who suggested that I made some mistakes and would like to do some things differently. This was not one of them. This was not one of them. This was far from ideal. It has absolutely resulted in a very significant increase in smears, and it has resulted in a backlog. As you, in fairness, acknowledge, not exclusively new women enter the programme, but I accept about 2/3, and that's a statement of fact. But I want to focus on how we reduce that backlog. But I do believe, regardless of whether the test was free or not, women were going to seek the repeat smear. For me, it was an issue as to did I support GPs who wanted to know what do I do if such a woman turns up. So that's, no matter how many times I'm asked this question, my view will never change on this. I lived cervical check and the debacle 24/7, intensively with my officials, people who worked so hard and showed real leadership. This was seen as an appropriate thing to do, not in normal circumstances, absolutely not. But we were not in normal circumstances, and we're now looking back from higher terrain with the benefit of hindsight and different views. Some opposition spokespeople have said, if I was the minister, I would have done the exact same thing. Others welcomed it at the time, and now say I shouldn't have done it. Others criticised cervical check management at the time and are now quoting them as the font of all wisdom. It's for people to decide what they want to do in that regard. But I stand by the decision, I own the decision, and I'm responsible for the decision.
Thank you, Minister. So given that, you said you wanted to correct me, but Dr. Flannelly's advice was given, and it was given before the announcement.
Sorry,
Tony O'Brien did talk to you the next day and ask you to walk the decision back. There was a world of difference between what you offered as minister and what was subsequently put out, which is a much more caveated approach. My understanding is that the Chief Medical Officer did not support a blanket offer under any circumstances, but supported a much more, you did, and that's, if I could just finish, you did, and that's what you offered publicly.
How?
The reality is, expert clinical advice was given. Expert clinical advice was ignored, but regardless of what happened in that weekend, because it was a very busy weekend,
sure, the
reality is, once the delays, as predicted by cervical check, began to mount through the year, you were contacted by the laboratories, by cervical check, by oncologists, by a variety of people saying, please stop with the test. You continued with the test through the year, and now today we've 80,000 women waiting, an indefinite delay to the HPV test, and we need to provision for that, which of course is what today's meeting is about. Sure. So given that you say you accept responsibility for your decision, and given that the committee now has multiple documented evidence that you were advised repeatedly to stop with the test because of the delays that it is causing, and given that you have admitted that that was your call, would you apologise to the 80,000 women who are now waiting up to 8 or 9 months for those test results, and indeed to the many more who are now waiting for the introduction of the HPV test?
So I significantly regret that women are waiting. I think we all do, and how we work to resolve that is what I'd really like to discuss in a moment, and following on from the HSE's contribution to this. But you were asking me, do I wish I'd made a different? Sorry, you may be asking me, do you wish I made a different decision? I do not believe it was possible to have made a different decision. Women were seeking this, GPs were seeking this, and you keep on saying expert clinical advice was given. My expert medical advice is given to me by the Chief Medical Officer, a man who showed extraordinary leadership in this situation, extraordinary leadership, after the failures of others, after the mistreatment of Vicky Phelan, after appalling decisions made to, if a woman dies, just stick a note in her file and don't tell her husband. These decisions were made by people carrying out a botched audit. And Tony Houlihan, Dr. Tony Houlihan stood up to the plate, and Dr. Tony Houlihan is the person I was taking my advice from. And I know, but you're suggesting,
I'm not suggesting, I'm asking a question.
You somewhat are speaking for my Chief Medical Officer, suggesting that my Chief Medical Officer gave different advice to what I advised the public.
I'm not, Minister, to be clear. What I'm saying is that Susan Mitchell, on the front page of the Sunday Business Post, directly makes that allegation.
She does, and she makes it based on reading. She makes it based on reading a tweet that I issued and what I was actually offered. The tweet, if we wish to quote my tweet, said, "We put a facility in place, arrangements will follow later." About 20 minutes later, we issued those arrangements via my department's Twitter and via a press release. We were entirely...
That's fine. So that's what Susan Mitchell is...
So myself and the Chief Medical Officer were at idem on this issue, just to finish that point. The question...
In the interest of time, no, the question I'm asking is... Thank you, and I'll finish on this, and then we'll come back to the estimates. The direct question I'm asking, Minister, is you have now accepted responsibility for the decision you made. The committee has multiple documented evidence that there was expert clinical advice given to the department before the announcement, that the DG of the HSE advised you to walk it back the next day, but I think more importantly that as the year progressed and the delays mounted, you were contacted directly from multiple sources to ask you to stop with the free test. You refused, and we now have 80,000 women waiting up to 8 months. And we have a lot more women waiting for the introduction of the HPV test. My question is, given that you accept responsibility, would you apologise to all of those women who are now waiting because of the decision you made against all of this advice?
You're trying to conflate issues and say I made a decision against advice. I made a decision to do the appropriate thing that I was requested to do by GPs and by women in the height of a crisis. And that decision, I believe, to this day, was the appropriate decision in a time of crisis. I regret extremely that there's women waiting a long time, and that's why we've been working night and day with the HSE to source additional capacity. This committee heard very clearly last week from Damien McCallion, another person who's worked tirelessly through this time, about the efforts of the HSE to identify additional capacity. They have now identified additional capacity. This week, as we're speaking, there is quality assurance and negotiations going on in relation to bringing that extra capacity on stream. If we can get, and I can only say if at this moment because I need to wait back from the HSE, if we can get this capacity on stream, I expect the backlog to be significantly and overwhelmingly reduced during the summer months. That's what my focus has to be on. You're not suggesting this, in fairness, Deputy, but obviously we have different turnaround times in different labs. Some of our labs are turning around these tests in 3 or 4 weeks, some in 6 or 7 weeks, and in the case of one lab there is a very long wait. Of that there is no doubt. The clinical risk, because it's important for women watching this programme today, outside of the politics of all of this, the clinical risk, we're told by people like Dr. Peter McKenna, is negligible, is very, very low, but that doesn't mean it's not stressful for people waiting, and I fully accept that. We will work night and day to resolve this situation. But I believe, and I believe many women believe, that in a time of crisis they didn't need any politician to tweet or make any decision. They were going to seek the reassurance themselves with their doctor. The question was, did I make them pay for it or not? And I felt after the significant disrespect that had been shown to women in terms of how the audit had been carried out, the appropriate thing for the state to do was to fund this. But what I will do, Chairman, and I've asked the HSE to do, is to keep this committee very closely appraised, and I'd welcome your cooperation in terms of working as we try to bring this extra capacity on stream. I know that's what we all want, and I would be hopeful that we can see progress in that in a very short period of time.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you, Deputy Donnelly. Now, Deputy Jonathan O'Brien is substituting for Louise O'Reilly, so Deputy Jonathan O'Brien.
Thanks, Chair, and I'll probably just go off script a little bit in terms of just the previous speaker. This is my own opinion, Minister. I believe what people were looking for, GPs, what women were looking for, was the repeat smear test, and I don't think that was the issue. That wasn't the failing. The failing was doing what you felt was appropriate, but not knowing whether we had the resources to actually fulfil that commitment. And maybe that's where the failing was, not so much in the decision, but the fact that the decision was made. And maybe on that you can just give us some indication of when you were making that decision. And I'm not questioning this decision, I think it was the right decision. But was there any discussions around whether we had the resources to actually commit to what we were providing?
Thank you for the honesty of your assessment that you and your party and many people felt that this was the right decision to make based on what women wanted and needed at the time, and I accept that. And I also accept fully that the challenge has been the fact that the impact that this has had on capacity. Being very truthful, and I think my officials have said this before, as of the HSE, and it is the absolute truth. It was impossible to estimate how many women would seek this, and that was really for 2 reasons. One, this was a very personal decision a woman needed to make with her doctor. And what we saw was 110,000 women went to their doctor, and 57, under this provision, if you like, and 57,000 decided to go for a repeat smear. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and I'm being very honest, one of the reasons that I think we have found a particular difficulty is that the period went on for longer than I would have liked. So this is absolutely not a criticism of Dr. Gabriel Scally. He's done an incredible job. But because he was doing such an incredible job, we had hoped as an Oireachtas to get his report in June, and he had asked could he carry on till I think September. So there was a longer period of time before I was able to turn off the decision, if you like, or pause the decision. In October, I received a submission from my department that said, "Okay, Minister," I'm paraphrasing, but it said, "Okay, Minister, we now have Dr. Scally's report. It provides good reassurance for the women of Ireland that the screening service is safe in terms of the laboratories we use, notwithstanding the shortcomings. You should now communicate to the HSE your intention to end their free repeat smear. And we did. I accepted my officials' advice in full. We communicated it to the HSE who operated it, and they said, decision accepted, Minister. But because we have smears booked in and the likes, we believe we'll operationalise that decision at the end of December. But I mean, it is important to point out, and I think you've acknowledged it. I mean, these were decisions being taken in real time. So I didn't have the opportunity to say, and this is a regret I have in general about a lot of things to do with the cervical check debacle. But in relation to this, the worry was real. It was live. It was present. Women were going to their doctors now, wanting to know what could you do. The phone line was up and running. Women were ringing into the phone line saying, can I have a repeat smear? GPs were saying, how can I sit in front of a patient and tell her, you've had your smear, a year ago, you have to wait another 2 years. So these decisions were being taken in real time. We were putting, I suppose, immediate steps in place to make arrangements with smear takers. The IMO came in and negotiated the fee, as a GP representative organisations. The president of the NAGP welcomed it as being the right decision. So we didn't have, I suppose, the opportunity to do that level of screening, and I accept that as a criticism. But I can't see how it could have been done differently, considering the crisis mode that we were in.
So much as a criticism, more as an observation that is the reason the backlog is there.
I take it as fair.
Can I move on to the Children's Hospital Chair, and before the Chair decides it's not within the estimates?
I think this one very much is.
Yeah, it is. I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask in relation to that, and I recognise, Minister, that you have asked that government would be given a number of weeks to assess the report, to look at the recommendations and decide how you proceed. There are a number of recommendations I would like to discuss with you, though. First of all, if we could just go back over some of the old ground, just to set it in context. I think the PwC report was very clear that the establishment of the National Children's Development Board put all the eggs in the one basket. So if there was successes, there was successes. If there was failures, then it was one point of failure. And that was the reason that the two additional monitoring groups were set up, the steering group and the programme group. Can I ask what were the terms? Well, we know what the terms of reference, but whose decision was it to appoint individuals to those boards or to those particular monitoring groups?
So those decisions were made by the government as part of the decision to proceed with the large part of the project. So there would have been consultation with my own department, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and then a decision made by government. So
they were political appointments to those.
Yeah, the government approved the structures, and obviously the people. I know you don't mean it like this. The people on it weren't political appointments; they were officials in the department. But government ministers, the government, myself, we made the decision in relation to the composition of that. Yes.
Okay. Do you believe that the terms of reference for those particular boards were very limited? Because I think the report says that they didn't have the ability or the experience to question some of the decisions which were being taken, that they could only monitor the information which was being provided to them. And if that is the case, do you think that was a failing at the time that the legislation was being developed and the terms of reference for those particular monitoring boards were established?
Yeah.
Sorry, sir, just to establish the issue in relation to what we're discussing today, and I know the Minister, you're happy to respond, but I need to say as chairperson that we are here to discuss the estimates. There is a reference, of course, in the estimates to the revision of the capital allocation to health. So if you're happy to answer those questions, Minister, that's fine. Yeah,
yeah, of
just
course.
to establish that.
Thanks for your fairness, Chair. But I'm more than happy. I wouldn't like to leave the elephant in the room in terms of the Children's Hospital, and obviously the fact that it is a very large amount of public expenditure. So I suppose to Deputy O'Brien's question, I suppose in 2007 the decision was made to set up a National Paediatric Hospital Development Board, and not to speak for my predecessors, but it was a decision I re-endorsed. So I can speak to that rationale. The rationale behind it was this was such a large project, on the mega scale, that departments, any department, the public service, wouldn't necessarily have the capabilities, or the capacity rather, to deliver this project. So that the sensible thing to do was to kind of bring in the experts, if you like, and appoint a competency-based board, and that was done. As we got towards the bigger stages of the project, the major construction stage, you're quite correct that the government decided, hang on a second, there's more than just building a hospital here. We're building a building, but we're also integrating 3 hospitals. And we're setting up an entire new entity. We're putting in a new IT system. You know, there's lots of different moving parts here, and there needs to be a structure to, as you say, oversee. And the government did approve that structure. I'm not going to give you a definitive on this today, but other than to say there's no doubt that the governance structures will need to change, and they will need to be strengthened. What the report doesn't find, and you haven't said, but you haven't said that it does. What the report doesn't find is that you know, there should be a clear out of the board. In fact, it
recommends against that.
It actually specifically recommends against that, exactly, because it actually says, I'm paraphrasing, but in order to speak, it basically says if you were to do that, you'd actually lose such corporate memory that you could jeopardise the project. But it does say that I need to strengthen it, and you know, you don't bring in auditors if you think everything's going great, and you don't bring in auditors if you're not going to accept their recommendations. So I'll be working with.
And that's one of the questions I was going to ask, Minister, because the report does say that you shouldn't have a complete clear out of the board because it would lose that corporate memory, but it also says that you need to strengthen it by putting the expertise and the competency on the board. How do you propose to do that, though, given that I think there's only 1 vacancy on the board at the moment?
So
so in order to bring that expertise on, people have to be stepped aside as well. And are you willing to do that, Minister?
So I'm willing to do whatever I believe it takes, but that's not my initial thoughts. My initial thoughts are that the statutory instrument does give me power to alter the size of the board, and to add people to the board. So whilst I haven't made, you know, less than 24 hours after its publication, I haven't made these decisions. What I can say with certainty is I will be strengthening the board, particularly in the areas that the PwC report has identified it should be strengthened. And I think of the whole area of health construction being an obvious area they've now highlighted that I need to respond to. So I will be strengthening the board. I would expect that will mean definitely additions. My understanding from advice is that I do have the legal ability to do that through the statutory instrument. But I will, and I also have, as you rightly say, a vacancy currently on the board as well. It is important to say the chair of the board, as you know, is brand new to this role too, and there will be a new project director because that individual has also announced previous to this report that they're intending to step down or move on. So yes, is the short answer. I'll be strengthening the board. I expect we'll be changing the governance arrangements. Myself and Minister Donoghue and our departments need to do some work on that. We have accepted, though, as a government, all 11 recommendations, so let there be no kind of ambiguity over that. We accept the 11 recommendations. What I suppose we have to do now is operationalise them and come up with a detailed implementation plan. I'd welcome the input of this committee in that regard. I also propose to meet with the authors of the report, because you can read a report, and I've read it a number of times already, but it's useful to have those people talk you through it and to scrutinise, I suppose, some of the lines and what was behind them in terms of what they think I should do next. And I'll also meet Fred Barry in the coming days as chair of the board to kind of get his sense of what further skill sets could help the project.
The steering group, who would that have been responsible to, Minister? So in terms of the information which was passed by the development board up to the steering group, where does it go after it reaches the steering group? You
mean the group chaired by the Secretary General to my department? Yeah. Yeah, so the Secretary General to my department reports to me. And the Secretary General to my department would have kept me briefed at the appropriate junctures, and I obviously published all of those documents in advance, and the good news is the PwC timeline tallies with that. I think there's two interesting points though in the report in relation to the governance issue. One is it does say that whilst the governance structure was complex, it does say that it did not impede information flow. So it doesn't seem to be suggesting to me reading it that caused that problem. But crucially, there's a line in the report that's very important about the role of my department and the HSE, and I suppose the government, though it doesn't name the government, is it does say that the department and the HSE were impaired, is the word they use, from effectively doing their job because of some of the mistakes, if you like, or errors that were made in arriving at accurate figures. So when you're in government, when you're a Secretary General, when you're the HSE, whoever you are, you're depending on accurate information from professional firms. You hire, and I don't want to name them here.
And timely.
Yeah, and I don't want to name them here because even though we have privilege in this place, I'm conscious that the board will have to consider all of these matters. But, you know, you do depend on professional expertise to give you accurate, factual information. Expertise, you hire them because you don't have the expertise yourself. And then you can scrutinise them and you can bring in other people, other experts to look at it again and again and again. And it is clear when you looked at the Children's Hospital project, it wasn't a case that, you know, the business case was kind of flung on my desk and I brought it to government next week. It was very, very, you know, a deliberative process, an intense deliberative process that went through. But fundamentally, some of the information we were given now appears to be wrong. There was a debate, you know, the debate was always, I heard the Taoiseach say during the height of this, you know, was this a case of taxpayers' money being wasted, or was it a case that the project was always going to cost more and we were given the wrong figures? PwC have very much come down on the view of the latter, largely, that there wasn't a massive waste of taxpayers' money here, but there was a significant error in calculating an accurate cost. It's kind of astonishing, really, when you depend on such experts.
And I agree, Minister, and the difficulty I have, and this is where we do have a difference of opinion, is obviously you appointed the board, you put that expertise on it.
I did.
That board was tasked with the responsibility of bringing this project in budget. If there was failings of the board, then that is directly at your feet, in my opinion. And I don't know if you accept that responsibility and that failings, but I am very firm in my beliefs that the political accountability for the failings lies at your feet, Minister. Would you accept that?
So I accept responsibility for the challenges of this project, and I tell you why I do, because if I was coming in here today and the project was, you know, ahead of schedule and 200 million under budget, sure, I'd be taking the credit for it, and so would you if you were a minister. So when you're in government, you have to take the good with the bad. We put experts in place, so did my predecessors, good, decent, hard-working people with expertise. Something clearly went wrong. PwC has given us an indication of where that might lie. I think the board need to reflect very seriously on that, including contracts that they may have had.
But this is the board.
But I accept. But I appointed the board, and I accept the responsibility in that regard. I also, though, just while we're on the issue of political responsibility, I do have to make the point, though, that there was a major political judgment call that I had to make in December with government colleagues, and that was I was given three options. Despite the cost escalation, do you want to proceed? Do you want to retender? Or do you want to pause? They were the three options I was given. I considered
you didn't really have an option, Minister.
Well, I considered them.
Let's be fair now, because the report was very clear. You didn't have an option at that stage.
You're an honest enough person to say that, right? But there are other people in this House, Deputy O'Brien, and let the record show it very clearly, who, if not in this committee room, certainly on the floor of the Dáil, said I made the wrong decision. They said I should have paused it. They said I should have retendered it. They said I should have moved the site. We've brought in financial auditors who found that the government and myself did make the right decision. So you've got to take political responsibility in the round.
But the difficulty is, by the time you were in a position to make that decision, it was too late to do anything else because of the failings that had happened previously.
That's correct. So
we could have retendered at an earlier stage if we had been aware of the issues which were coming down the line.
Certainly.
And here is the big issue for me. And this is nothing personal to the two people on either side of you, but both of those individuals, to the best of my knowledge, were on the steering committee, Mr. Desmond and Mr. Breslin. They became aware in April that there was an issue in relation to potential cost overrun. There was Tracy Conroy who asked for a memo to be sent to you in, I think it was May. That memo didn't reach you until August, but yet the board was reappointed in June. And I don't know if Mr. Breslin or Mr. Desmond wants to answer this question, but one of the questions I would have is why those issues were not brought to your attention, knowing that the board was being reappointed in June, knowing that there was issues which were there, they hadn't crystallised, but we knew there was going to be issues in relation to cost overruns. There was a request by an official in your department that a memo be sent to you prior to the reappointment of the board. That memo didn't go. You went away and reappointed the whole board. You asked no questions of the board because you clarified that in the PQ. There was a request came in and you decided that you were going to reappoint them. There was no questions asked, no progress reports requested, but yet Mr. Desmond and Mr. Breslin were both aware. I accept they would not have been aware of the extent of the overrun at that point, but they would have been aware that there was issues coming down the line. And I'm just wondering why Mr. Breslin and Mr. Desmond didn't convey that to you given the fact that one of their colleagues had asked for a memo to be sent to you.
Sure. So in fairness to my officials, because it's a select committee...
Just your last question, Deputy O'Brien, and I don't think, I think you're the only person who can speak this morning.
I can, but
I understand
that's the way it should be. I mean, I'm accountable to the Oireachtas and my officials are accountable to me. I'm satisfied that my officials behaved entirely appropriately during this, and the reason I am satisfied with that is that the report, the PwC report, doesn't find anything to the contrary, and actually finds that their work, this is my very clear interpretation of what they find, is that it was impeded and impaired as a result of some of the failures that happened. Let's call it further down the line. Now, in relation to the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board, and in fairness, you've raised this a number of times before the PwC report, so you've a consistent record in this, and I acknowledge that. The PwC report, though, does find that actually a changing of the board could have caused a bigger problem. So, in my view, the right decision was to reappoint the board. The question I'm asking, and I'm asking it now as opposed to answering it today, but I'll be asking Mr Barry it, I'll be considering it with Minister Donoghue, and I'll be reporting to government in due course on an implementation plan, is what about the information that the Development Board received when the Development Board hired quantity surveyors or hired other people to cost the project? And on page 4 of this report, it finds that there were very, I'll be careful of my words, but very peculiar ways of going about some of the business there that did cause difficulty. And there's quite a detailed chapter then that shows that as well. So I accept the bona fides of my officials. Nowhere in the report does it suggest that there was a difficulty with information flow. In fact, it actually says, despite the complex governance structures, there wasn't an issue with information flow.
And despite all that, and it's the final comment, Chair, we had an official from DPOR sitting on that particular board. And that raises even more concerns for me, given the position he held within DPOR and what this report now says in terms of the information that was coming forward to the steering group, the ability of the steering group and the programme group to actually act on that information. I mean, the difficulty is we now have a board, in my opinion, which this report questions maybe their capability. And that's my reading of the report. We now have a situation where we need additional members, additional expertise brought on. And the difficulty is people don't have confidence. Well, I certainly don't have confidence in the current board, given what I've now read in the report. But yet, the report also says you can't have a widespread clear-out. And it's how you manage that and how you regain that credibility in the development board without having a complete clear-out and leaving in place some of the individuals who are directly responsible, in my opinion, for some of the failings and the fiascos we now face.
Yeah, just as I accept political responsibility, as does the government, the board obviously have to accept responsibility, and I'm sure they do for the decisions that they made. The report is clear, and I agree with you on this point. I mean, the report is clear that the governance structures need to be strengthened, the board will need to be strengthened, and I will act on that as well. There's also an interesting and important recommendation, I think it's recommendation 11 in the report, about the need for government as a whole or the public service to get a challenge function for future projects, absolutely. But I mean, there does need to be, we're building the Children's Hospital. I want to build a new National Maternity Hospital. I want to start that later this year. The government will want to do metro and broadband, I hope, and there will be other big major projects. And what the report is suggesting, this is a good thing about bringing in orders, it's meant to show you how to improve process. It does say we need to create a more proactive, challenging structure that, that we need to have the expertise. So I'll give you one view, and this is an initial view. My department, since the establishment of the HSE, doesn't have a building unit. So I have a chief medical officer, we've been talking about him, I have a chief nursing officer, I have a chief dentist, I'm sure I have chief other things as well in the Department of Health. Don't actually have somebody who's, a chief construction officer or who can give you an expert view on QS or the likes, and maybe having those functions available would help provide a further layer of scrutiny and challenge. So I think we need to reflect on that, the skill set in my department and indeed in other departments, and it's not a disrespect to anyone in the department, but it's the need to further strengthen our own skill set. So look, myself and Minister Donoghue will take the 4 weeks, we'll welcome the committee's input, and we'll be back to government and ultimately to publish an implementation plan.
We may not have that expertise, but we have a building control policy framework. We have, we have many layers of oversight, outside of individual departments.
Of that there's no doubt, but how we strengthen that, I think, is the question.
Thank you. Now we're going to ask Deputy Bernard Durkan for his comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I think that there's an unusual appraisal of the estimates in the sense that two issues seem to dominate the agenda. And I would point out, that we need to look at the rest of the agenda as well, because it's a very important budget, a very expensive budget, one that requires, has in the past required further attention as the year goes by. And but to dispense with the other two subjects first, if I might, first of all, I think when we have the benefit of hindsight, we generally are correct in everything. It's 2020 vision afterwards. But I think in relation to the cervical smear tests, I think we should remember one thing. It wasn't the greatest day in the delivery of services to the women who tried to avail of those services. When it transpired that some of them weren't told what the outcome was, some of them, there was a pause indicated at one stage. Somebody said there should be a pause, and that their health suffered. Their health suffered. A considerable number of women, and still not resolved. And I think we tend to dismiss that with the passage of time, how serious that was. And I have no doubt that the obvious thing to do was to err on the side of safety, take whatever steps had to be taken to ensure that a reassurance was made available to all the women who wanted it, to consult their GPs, and on the basis of that advice either to have another test, many of them didn't of course, or not to, depending on what the advice was. I think it was the right decision. I think milling around with it afterwards is just a waste of time. It's just play acting, and we can spend the next 12 months doing that. It's not going to change the reality of the issue, and that was that there were problems, serious problems. Some of them still exist in relation to the speed with which tests are carried out and the various laboratories. I think it was an appalling thing to happen, and I think it shouldn't have happened. But I remember that that wasn't put in place, that system wasn't put in place last year or last month, several years ago. Some of us didn't think very wisely of it at the time, but it was there. And it did serve its purpose in this sense, that it did save the lives of a lot of women. And that has been already illustrated again and again and again. So we have to, you see, it's a bit like the Minister taking responsibility for the bad news and the good news. We, in the House, in general, have to do the same thing. Either it did address the issues insofar as a lot of women were concerned in general. We know that it wasn't an accurate diagnostic procedure and all that goes with it. But we also have to recognise that all cases now, notwithstanding disclosure decisions and full disclosure, which doesn't seem to take place, still doesn't seem to take place, and I can't understand why. And I'm sure that's a matter for another day. But the fact of the matter is this, that ultimately in the courts, evidence emerged to the effect that there was a considerable neglect of the procedures that should have taken place in the interest of health and safety, in the interest of women who were the subject of particular tests. And I think it would be totally unacceptable if anything other than moving everything that could be done to ensure that those women still with a question mark in their minds over their health should be reassured, because the panic that starts obviously was causing other problems as well for women. So I have to say that I'm weary of listening to the same story over and over again. We need to improve the quality of the tests. We need to improve the veracity. We need to improve the speed with which they're done and the speed with which the results are obtained. But going back over what happened over the last 20 years is not going to solve that problem. Other than to say this, I think we all should recognise that the extent to which women were traumatised, women's health was put in jeopardy, and the lives put in jeopardy, was totally unacceptable, totally and absolutely unacceptable. I don't wish to proceed as long as my colleagues are not suggesting for a moment that they should curtail their outbursts in future or anything like that. But I will try to deal with insofar as I can. The Children's Hospital. One of the issues that I raised in the very beginning in this committee meeting, Mr. Chairman, was that there were a number of boards sitting in parallel, as it were. And I wasn't satisfied that the degree of discussion between those boards was adequate. And I'm still not satisfied that it was adequate. The fact is simply this. In a project of that size, and you have a number of bodies, all dealing with the same project, all hopefully going in the same direction, and there's not a common membership. I think there needs to be a common membership. That's my opinion. It's not an expert opinion, but I believe that in a project of that size, you need common membership, where all the boards, the various parts of the jigsaw, are all alert to what's happening all of the time. Now, the other thing that I think has been very misleading throughout this entire debate is the basis on which, and I haven't seen the report, I haven't seen the Pricewaterhouse report at all, I haven't read any part of it yet, so this is I know it's around and all that kind of thing, but unfortunately I had other things to do as well over the last couple of days, as I'm sure everybody else had too. But I do feel that the original estimate of the costs, I think it was wrong. I think it didn't take into account the magnitude of the project, and I think I think therein lies a flaw in the system. And any other projects that are being undertaken, we need to know at the very beginning what the actual cost is. And there are PC sums that are added in all construction situations that will enable us in committee, or the Minister, or the HSE, or whatever the case may be, to come to a conclusion if something is going in the right direction or if something is going wrong. It would appear from what I've heard of the Pricewaterhouse report that there were issues that arose that should and could have been nobbled at a much earlier stage. What would happen as a result of that is another thing. It might well have brought a halt to the entire project. And I'm not so sure that would be a good idea. And I want to point out also, Mr. Chairman, that this is the second or third attempt at providing the Children's Hospital, site-wise and every other way. An attempt was made previously to superimpose it on the Mater Hospital. That didn't work. There was a lot of debate about it at the time, but Board Prenall eventually made that decision. There was a lot of money wasted. There was a lot of money spent on that particular outing, and a lot of that money was because I raised the question on that at the time. I raised the question as to whether or not the initial expenditure could be of benefit in the subsequent location and on site, with a view to using whatever information we had gleaned from the first episode. It didn't happen. It didn't really happen. A little bit of it did, but not generally speaking. I think also, Mr. Chairman, that we have to make another decision as well, and it's simply this. I think an attempt was made by the boards, between them one way or the other, and the HSE, to curtail what looked like an overrun. That certainly was an overrun in comparison to the original estimates. And I think that probably at that stage it was too late. I think it would have caused a major hiccup, and I think it could cause the project to be abandoned, and all that goes with it. And I think that wouldn't be in the interest of anybody. Certainly not in the interest of children, and certainly not in the interest of value for money, which is something that this committee doesn't deal with, nor should it deal with. But we do have a policy role. And I have to say this, that I cannot understand, for example, if a quantity surveyor's report was available at the very beginning, how it transpired that an estimate is all I can say about the original costing, how that emerged based on the information that was available at the time. I can't understand what that happened. And maybe we might get some more information on that. Some of those questions. Yes.
Minister, thank you
very much, and thank Deputy Durkan And again, I suppose to reiterate, that was the basis on which I made the decision for the repeat smear test, to endeavour to provide that reassurance that women were already seeking. And quite frankly, whether I tweeted, issued a press release or did it or not, they were going to seek the reassurance, because women make their own decisions about their own healthcare, and I thought that was a place we'd moved to in this country, and a good place to be in. In relation to, you mentioned the issue of open disclosure, and I'm really glad you did, because at the heart, I think something we can all agree on, at the heart of the cervical check debacle was the failure to openly disclose. It was about the issue of non-disclosure, and we are now legislating through the Patient Safety Bill, which I know this committee has considered a pre-legislative stage as well. And the Patient Safety Bill is a government priority, is on our priority list, and that will legislate for mandatory open disclosure for serious reportable incidences, which I think is an important point. You made some points in relation to governance, which I think are valid. As I've said to Deputy O'Brien, there will clearly be a need to strengthen the governance of that, there's no doubt. The report's very specific in relation to that. It also talks about the need for closer alignment as we move closer to the opening of the project between the Children's Health Ireland Board, these are the Children's Hospital Group, the group within our health service that will run the hospital, and the Build Board, the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board to build the hospital. I think that becomes all the more important when we consider that the Connolly part of this hospital is going to open this year. So we're still having a debate in the Oireachtas about, is it the right site or all this sort of stuff. But actually, like, the Connolly part's opening and the James's part's well underway. There's about 400 people working on the site and over €200 million spent. So how I square that circle in terms of recognising that they both have separate functions and separate roles, but the view of PwC that there needs to be closer alignment is something I'll be reflecting on in the coming weeks. Just the issue of, you referenced the issue of kind of cost reduction, and this was an important issue. In fairness, I want to acknowledge Deputy Donnelly asked that this be included in the terms of reference, and was indeed specifically included at his request. I think the report is clear that the opportunities are limited. On page 6, it talks about the cost reduction opportunities being limited because 85% of the budget is already contractually committed. So it does suggest that the focus of the board should now be on reducing further the risk for additional cost at this stage, and that's where I'd hope their focus would be on. It does say, though, that there is a technical possibility of reducing some costs, but they need to be offset against any risk. So when I meet Mr. Barry, I'll be asking that the board formally considers that and gives me their view in relation to that. Thank you.
Deputy.
Thank you, Minister. The other point that I raised is the question about the relationship between the various levels of management. And I know that the Minister referred to the governance and so on, but I believe there was an inadequate linkage between the people with responsibilities. How they were brought together is a question that I would automatically have concern about, and how often. Now, I asked that question of themselves previously, and of some of the people present as well, to the effect that they were kept up to date was the answer. But it sounded like on a monthly basis. That wouldn't be nearly close enough for a project like this. These things shift very rapidly, and things can change suddenly. And waiting for a monthly meeting at which you update your colleagues on something wouldn't, to my mind, be the way to do it. And in some cases, it could be more than a month. It could be 2 months, depending on the time that the meetings took place. So I'm not certain whether the Minister wants to relate to that as well. But I would also say this, that in relation to future possible overruns, if we're dealing with an absolute quantity surveyor's picture, I think we should know fairly well early on where we're going, and the extent to which future overruns can take place has to be minimised for a whole lot of reasons. The reasons being that if we allow ourselves to have some mystery about what the future holds for us in this kind of scene, I think it's dangerous. A dangerous place to be, dangerous place to go, and notwithstanding the Pricewaterhouse report and the benefits of it, and we all accept that, but the fact of the matter is this, that unless we have found a way to ensure that the price we're now looking at, the contract prices we're now looking at, are stable, that they're going to remain that way, or they're going to escalate, in which case, then, we're all at fault, because it can be alleged at some later stage that, well, we did discuss these things, and things happened afterwards. So I would ask particularly that question be addressed. The extent to which, from here on in, I can assume that we didn't get an accurate estimate of the quantities involved in the beginning, or it wasn't available, or we proceeded before we should have, and that's one of them. But from here on in, we need to be much more accurate, Mr. Chairman, on all of the quantities involved, and any change that might take place. If changes take place, then we need to know about that and for what purpose, because otherwise we can have another problem.
Thank you, Deputy Durkan. I very much take on board his Deputy Durkan's points, and we'll be considering them in the context of our response to the report. Thank
you very much, Minister. Now we're going to ask Deputy Kate O'Connell. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming in this morning. I'll just start with the paediatric hospital, just to continue on from Deputy Durkan. I suppose I have the report. I haven't read yet, I admit, but there's something in it under governance that particularly, I suppose, really sums it all up. The level of trust that the NHDB placed on the NPH executive. So the level of trust between the board and the executive and the design team gave rise to insufficient scepticism and challenge. The structures above the NPHDB became reactive. So really, I suppose, when I've read the executive summary on that and the recommendations, but to me the price now is reflective of the quality of the project and what has been put on, what has been put forth as what's going to be above the ground. But I mean, the Taoiseach said grim reading, and I'm sure you didn't find it overly pleasant yourself either, Minister. But in terms of, like, the board was there to be accountable to the taxpayers of Ireland. And when we see fancy designs, and I really mean that in the nicest possible way, when you see big glass curvy buildings, that's just, to me, an architect's dream. That's when people with a specific remit, which is design, go down that route. And usually in a project you have quantity surveyors on both sides. You have a group of quantity surveyors acting for the client and for the builder, and some are the contractor, and somewhere along the line it's decided how much money will be spent on a metre of cable or whatever your basic product is. And when you read this, my interpretation of it is that it was almost free rein. That there was no challenge to the design, and therefore by the time the design was done and set in stone, it was too late to pull back. Now, I do believe you made the correct decision. I know Deputy O'Brien said you probably had no choice but to make the decision. But I do think it's very important here, and I'll get on to cervical and the history of it in the past. But this project, as Deputy Durkan keeps saying, I think it's 1962 when it was first mentioned. And we've said here for so long that we are desperately in need of a children's hospital, and I think you made the right decision. I think it was the only decision to make, and I think if you'd made a different decision at the end of last year, this hospital would never be built. Definitely wouldn't be built in my lifetime or your lifetime. So I do think, despite the political challenges, historic and current, and despite the hospital politics and all of the other medical politics and every other sort of politics, that, you know, to deliver this, despite the challenges, is hopefully going to be, along with all the rest of the things you've achieved to date, key to, I suppose, what you have done as Minister. But that doesn't take from the fact that, for taxpayers and for all of us, that when we have a huge sum of money, and when it basically says that the people who were there representing us on the board didn't challenge, it's really annoying. I find it really frustrating, because it seems obvious to me, if a big fancy glass curvy building, that somebody on the quantity surveillance side on our side, or the taxpayer side, would go, hold on now a second, is there a need for that many curves and a need for that much glass, or is there a need for that much aluminium or whatever? That's normally what happens. And I think in light of some of the overruns in the past, I think that's what people find so frustrating, that we didn't have, I suppose, the people we were paying, the quantity surveyors acting on behalf of the HSE or the board or the taxpayer, but ultimately being supposed to represent good value for money, that it doesn't appear that they were doing that for us, and that's really, really frustrating. So you might mention or comment on when the state pays fees to a professional body to act on their behalf in an expert role, and if that don't do their job right. What is the recourse here? In terms of cervical, in terms of the capacity issue, again, I know we've discussed it for so long now, but I just think, again, a bit like the hospital, it's worth remembering where cervical has come from. And Dr. Harty, I imagine the chair, is very much aware of the pushback 15 years ago when cervical screening became possible, when HPV became possible. And I remember a particular bishop in the south of Ireland, suggesting that we wouldn't need cervical vaccination or screening if women led pure and chaste lives. So we've come a huge distance from that sort of rhetoric to where we are now. And I think I'm right in saying that as a result of cervical for the last as many years as it's going, that there's 65,000, I think I heard you saying that maybe in the chamber, but I think it's 65,000 women have had things picked up through cervical that required either a bit of burning or minor intervention up to and including invasive treatment. So if the minister who brought that in wasn't brave enough to have done that back in the day, there are 65,000 women in Ireland, some of which will be dead, some of which will be incapable of having children, various degrees of complexities as a result of no intervention. And I think there was commentary last week about perhaps suspending the system, and we had a lot of discussion around other countries where they ramped up capacity in the cervical before they brought in HPV and all that. But I really do think, in terms of the amount of money that has been invested in cervical and the amount of, I suppose, personal capital by progressive ministers for health over the years, that it would be the wrong decision, and I'm not here to advise you, as there seems to be so many people that advise you, but I just think that it just would be the wrong thing to do to in any way pull back on a system that has had a positive impact on 65,000 women, and I suppose the others that had no negative result. But I also think that, and I mentioned it here last week, we were operating in an information vacuum when this all broke. We did not know who owned the slides. We actually didn't know in the immediate instance were the slides gone off and were they the custody of a lab. We did not know, was it a standards issue in the lab. We didn't actually know what the reason for the emerging cases were. And that caused a huge amount of fear. And I've spoken about it before, there's no need to repeat it, but in terms of reassurance, how do you reassure women and their families, in some cases, who are concerned? How do you reassure somebody, as Minister for Health, that the situation in this, where there was destructive commentary coming from many sections, people talking about misdiagnosis, people using terms that just were not reflective of the situation. What is the best way to reassure people? Is it to send them a note? Is it to put an ad on the telly? Is it to run a radio ad on Newstalk? Like, in that week or two after that, would it have been any benefit to me or any other woman of my age to listen to an ad, and I'm not being smart here, on Newstalk or whatever, going, don't worry, women of Ireland, you're in safe hands, cool off, no need to go to the doctor. My personal view is that the public health nurse nor the community pharmacist was skilled in delivering this reassurance. The only person that could deliver this reassurance, no offence, Minister, was the GP. Yep. It's the only person that was capable. You're not a medical doctor, I'm not a medical doctor, none of us, myself is, but the level of reassurance had to come because we were in such an information vacuum. And that seems to be forgotten here, that reassurance sometimes for people is very, very personal, and if somebody had a previous history or family history, they may have needed a level of reassurance more than somebody else. So you might speak to the reassurance bit. And then vaccines. In terms of what are we going to do about the massive drop in our measles vaccination rates and the subsequent we very successfully with HPV, we have a backup with the help of Laura Brennan and your department and various other people. We have a backup over 70. But in terms of the measles, it's a little bit late when we have wards full, isolation units full of children infected by measles. At that stage, it's out of control. And we can have Brexit problems, and we can have children's hospital problems, and we can have all these problems. But if we have a measles outbreak where the patches and pockets join up across Ireland, we have something far bigger than Brexit or Children's Hospital or whatever the other issues we're dealing with, because babies will actually be dying, immunocompromised people will be dying, and children will be left with life-limiting conditions as a result of infections. So, I mean, we can spend all the money we want on health, but if the basic fundamentals of protecting population health aren't maintained, we have a huge waste of money for investment since they invented the vaccines to now. So perhaps you might speak to that, because I know you had commentary in the paper today. You may want, I didn't actually read the article yet, but in terms of how we protect our population and how we get value for money in terms of what we've invested to the past. And I mean, there's obviously a massive cost if we have a massive outbreak of measles as well. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much. So look, I want to thank Deputy O'Connell for her questions. Look, just on the issue of cervical cancer, this is something I know we're all united on. We can actually effectively eradicate it. So there's actually many diseases we can't say this about. This is one that we can effectively eradicate. And I used to quote Australia and New Zealand and the huge progress we made there. I now only need to quote Scotland, a much nearer neighbour, in terms of the huge progress that they're making there. I was only reading about that last week, and we know how we do it. And the good thing to come out of all of this, and we always wanted something good to come out of that, is that now is our national aim: eradicate cervical cancer within a generation, effectively. And we know how to do it. HPV testing, HPV vaccination, and continuing to invest in our screening programmes. So I think that's a really important point to actually make. I'm really pleased you acknowledge the progressive moves of some of my predecessors in relation to this, because we were in opposition at the time, and I think she was given an awful hard time with the benefit of hindsight. Maybe that's just the way it goes when you're Minister for Health. But if you actually look at some of the decisions that Mary Harney took, we owe her a huge debt of gratitude in relation to the work she did on cancer care, and the governments that she was a part of. Because if you actually look in relation to the decisions she took about this cervical screening programme, that is a decision that has saved lives. And I suppose often when you're Minister for Health, you take a decision today and you only actually begin to see the positive impact of that public health decision in years to come. And I hope some of the decisions we've taken collectively, be it on the Public Health Alcohol Act, women's reproductive rights, things we're going to do in relation to the AHR bill, the extension of the HPV vaccine for boys, will in time, when there's a future Minister for Health sitting here, have had similar public health benefits. But I just wanted to acknowledge her. Look, you yet again hit the nail on the head. There was an information vacuum in relation to the crisis regarding cervical check. Women were worried, understandably worried. They weren't irrationally worried, they were understandably worried. Nobody could say, hand on heart, our screening programme is safe. And what do we do to try and get that reassurance? Well, we bring in an expert, a brilliant expert in Dr. Gabriel Scally, and he did a superb job. But what do we do in the interim? Well, in the interim, what we do is we support women in making decisions that women want to make themselves about their own personal health. And women were making the decision, not me, not you, women were making the decision to go to their GP. Because that's what you do when you're concerned about your health, as you'll know, Chairman, as a GP. That's what you do. You go and you talk to your doctor. The question was, when you go and talk to your doctor, and the woman's sitting there looking at her doctor, what can the doctor do? So the doctor can do what the doctor's meant to do, provide factual information and try and reassure. And we saw in the case of 110,000 women, for many of those women, pretty much a majority, or at least 50%, that satisfied the concern of the woman, decided, I don't need a repeat smear. And in 57,000 of those cases, the woman in consultation with her GP. And who the hell are we to second guess that decision? How offensive is it for people to mansplain what went on in those consultations, or endeavour to suggest, as I heard someone on the floor of the Dáil yesterday, it was unnecessary. Unnecessary. The woman met her doctor, had a consultation with her doctor, and the woman and her doctor decided, in the round, a repeat smear was the appropriate thing to do. My job, my only job, was to fund it, and we did it. And it was the least we could have done in that regard. I do think there's a point, though, and I think you were hitting on it, I do think there's a point, though, in terms of learning, as to what do we do when a public health crisis breaks out. And I've put my hands up in relation to this and conceded that I made mistakes. Sadly, I'm in a kind of lonely place in relation to that because not many others have, despite Dr. Scally's finding about the frenzied political and media environment at the time. But what do we do when actually a public health crisis breaks out in terms of that reassurance? I think the Chief Medical Officer showed what you do. He showed huge leadership. He went on national television. He brought together clinicians. But I think, and my words not his, it was a somewhat lonely place. So I think we need to look what we do in relation to the next time, and there will be a next time, that there will be a crisis in some element of our public health service as well. On the issue of vaccination, I am unapologetically pro-vaccine, and I have very little time, as I know do you, for the misinformation and the nonsense that is spread in relation to vaccination. It saves lives, and unfortunately the misinformation about vaccines isn't just an irritant. It's costing lives, and as you rightly say, it's costing a lot of our children health. And we have seen, now I do need to set this in context, we have seen a good uptake rate, and we still have a very good uptake rate in our child immunisation programme. I think that's worth saying. We have a target of 95% this year. I think it was 92.5% last year. So the overwhelming majority of parents are deciding that we should vaccinate our kids. But I was asked in recent weeks, look at what other countries are doing, other European countries are doing, and indeed some parts of the United States are doing, where they're linking the issue of enrolment in school with the issue of vaccination. And I haven't definitively said this is what we must do, but I do think we should be part of that debate. There's a discussion happening across the European Union as to what do you do in relation to vaccination. If the decision to vaccinate your child is not just a decision that you're making in relation to your child's welfare, if you decide not to vaccinate your child, you're sending your child unvaccinated into a school or a creche to potentially spread illness around there as well. So I think Ireland needs to be part of that debate. I intend to look at what other European countries are doing in this regard. I know Italy made some changes here recently. I know the state of New York made some changes, and perhaps this is something that I know the Health Committee is a very busy agenda, but that the Health Committee might in due course like to hold hearings on, as to how do we proactively use all of the levers as a public service to promote vaccination. And I do think there's a responsibility on us as parents that's greater than a responsibility to our own kids, but is also a responsibility to other people's children in terms of public good. And I think sending your child unvaccinated into a school is an extraordinarily irresponsible and dangerous thing to do. And Ireland needs to be a part of that debate that's happening right across the EU.
Minister, I can ask you, in terms of that, you mentioned going into school. Well, I mean, I'd put it to you, an unvaccinated child going into a hospital, where they give in Crumlin, where you have kids going around with masks. I mean, it's just, there seems to be a level of unawareness of how serious measles can be. In terms of other elements of the MMR, the mumps issue, and we've had an outbreak of mumps in some of our universities recently, and you just briefly mentioned the AHR bill. I mean, I just think it's very, very important to point out that young men affected by mumps in university, there's a knock-on effect on their fertility, and that's, you may be trying to avoid being fertile in college to some extent, but perhaps to the future, it's something that you're looking to have, children when you settle down or whatever. But I just think there has to be a pushback in terms of the patient or the child that wasn't vaccinated, in terms of knowledge when it comes to the real effects on your life to the future. So is there any plans in terms of making young men realise that if they weren't vaccinated as a child, that there's a serious problem potentially into their future that could have massive knock-on effects on their life and their hopes to the future? So is there any plan there?
Yeah, I'll reflect on how best we get that message across. I mean, in fairness to the HSE, an organisation that gets a lot of criticism and a lot of issues, I think an area where they've really stepped up is the area of promoting vaccination. I think the National Immunisation Office has done a really, really good job with powerful patient advocates on the issue of cervical cancer. We think particularly of the late Laura Brennan, who did so much. We need to, you get accused of nanny statism and all this sort of nonsense. This is life and death, this is health, this is public good. We have vaccinations that have effectively eradicated diseases. Whereas, so people of my generation think we should just read about them in history books, but they're beginning to come back they're beginning to come back due to the misinformation being spread, often through social media, though not exclusively. And we need to be on that pitch pushing back, and we all need to work together on it. I think the HPV Alliance was a really good example of politicians, clinicians, and patient advocates coming together. We need to look at other examples, but we do need to not rule out any measure. We need to actually say we're going to explore every and any measure to make sure vaccination is the norm, and to make sure that we all realise that it's not just a personal decision that you are making for your child. It's a decision that has an impact on other people's children. Vaccinations only work when we obviously have they call it the herd immunity, but when you actually have enough people vaccinated. So I'd very much welcome any guidance from the committee on this. I intend to speak to EU counterparts though on what's being done in other countries in relation to our schools, our creches and places where we know our children go on a daily basis.
Thank you very much, Minister.
Have we any answers on the accountability of the quantity surveyors, of the professionals? Sorry,
Sorry, I can't read my own writing. Yeah, so I mean, I need to be very careful what I say because, as I point out, while we have privilege here, I don't want to say anything that could undermine a decision that may or may not be made. But the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board has contracts with professional bodies on our behalf, effectively as taxpayers, and their contracts for professional services. My initial reading of this PwC report, when we brought in the financial auditors, is it raises questions about the accuracy of some of the information that was given, and that had a complete knock-on effect in terms of the cost estimation, where the PwC report does not find that there was a waste of taxpayers' money, but what it does find is that this project was always going to cost more than we thought. And why was that? Because, well, let's read the report, but page 4 suggests that some of the information given had material errors in it. So I think there's significant questions for some professional companies to answer. Don't intend to go further than that today, but I do intend to meet with the chair of the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board to get his view in relation to that, and I presume they'll seek advices on this, and I should hope they do.
Thank you very much, Minister. Minister, just to come back to the estimates, the topic for today.
Coming back might be a generous place,
In relation to the briefing document and in relation to cervical check, it says funding has been provided for cervical check for the introduction of HPV testing as a primary screening test. So perhaps you might speak about that and how close are we to moving towards HPV testing, which of course will revolutionise the screening programme and reduce the burden on cytology, which is the reason why we have such a large backlog. The second question is in relation to the new subhead in the estimates in relation to Sláintecare. There is a figure of 206 million which has been allocated to Sláintecare, but much of that 206 million is money that was already announced in relation to mental health, the National Treatment Purchase Fund, the GP contract, etc. But there isn't any reference in the estimates in relation to a transitional fund, which was one of the recommendations of Sláintecare. There is an integration fund, of course, but no reference to transitional funding, which is so important to get Sláintecare off the ground. So perhaps you might comment on that. In relation to the capital allocation of 24 million from the Department of Health's capital spending to make up part of the 99 million which will be required this year to fund the National Children's Hospital, can you give us any indication of what reprofiling will take place within the Department of Health and its capital plan? The National Service Plan, in its commentary, says it will have difficulty in maintaining existing services this year, and will have very little money. I think it may be 198 million for new developments in relation to the health service. So the National Service Plan is highlighting that there may be difficulties in meeting their budget target this year. So perhaps you might comment on that. And finally, Minister, a catalyst for change and a catalyst for implementing Sláintecare is the development of the individual health identifier and the electronic health record. And I note in the briefing document that an extra 25 million has been allocated to ICT for this year, I think bringing it up to 85 million. When do you think we will see the individual health identifier and the electronic health record being rolled out? So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Chairman, to try and take them in sequence. So look, you are correct that there isn't specific transition fund in this year's estimate on that's the fact of the matter. What there is, and I suppose what I'm trying to reflect in the document, and I believe passionately, and there is a number of areas where significant resources are being spent on what are sláinte care measures. And I suppose the culture change that I need to happen, and in fairness that I believe is happening in the HSE and is in the department, is that everything we need to do needs to be in the direction of sláinte care. I'll get back on the transition fund in a second, but just if you look at, for example, the decision to reduce the drug payment scheme cap, the decision to reduce the prescription charges are directly from the sláinte care report. The money for the GP contract, which 27 million will be spent this year, is funding that was held in my department that's in line with the sláinte care programme. There's no doubt about that when you read the things that GPs are agreeing to do in return in terms of integrating with primary care, medicines management, waiting list validation, e-health, and ultimately obviously the chronic disease management from January is sláinte care in action. There's no doubt about that as well. There is, you actually referenced it at the end, but there is, I suppose, some degree of transition funding in relation to the e-health area and the ICT area, and I'll get back to you on a time frame of that in a moment. But that's no doubt classified as sláinte care and is transition funding. So I suppose I have an integration fund this year. My expectation would be, now that I've created that as an actual discrete area of expenditure, that we could look to increase that quite significantly next year. I mean, that is my aim. There's 20 million in it this year, but I think, you haven't suggested this, I think it would be unfair to suggest that we're only spending that on sláinte care when the other elements are clearly delivering sláinte care too. So there's a lot of work that's been done. I feel sláinte care has begun to come alive in the last number of weeks. I know there's a briefing for Health Committee members today with the director of the sláinte care office. It is now up and running. 2019 is, I suppose, the first year of it in action. In relation to the HSE capital plan, so we are preparing the HSE capital plan. We're engaging with both the HSE and the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform now. I expect to publish it shortly after Easter. Being very blunt and honest with the committee, what I'm trying to do and trying to arrive at a point is where I publish more than just the 2019 capital plan. For obvious reasons. If I publish the 2019 capital plan, it'll give you a piece of the picture, but lots of projects that we start in 2019, everyone in your constituency and mine will want to know, well, are you going to build it in 2020? Going to design or going to tender is one thing, but have you the money to build it in 2020 or 2021? So what I'm endeavouring to do, and it's complex, is I'm endeavouring to publish a number of years, 2 to 3, so that we can show, not just if we take your part of the country, not just the modular build for Limerick, that we can actually show the profiling of that funding for the next couple of years. So I expect you'll be inviting me back here, no doubt, in the month of May on a capital plan, and I expect that I will have it published. Then, but there's a lot of intense work going on that at the moment. In relation to the reprofiling, I think, as you know, in relation to health, we were asked to make a €24 million, as you said, contribution this year, and that has come out of effectively the minor fund, the minor works fund, if you like, in the HSE, where you replace a piece of equipment or the likes as it requires to be replaced. There's still more in that fund this year than there was last year, but what we have been able to do is say that all projects that are contracted and underway are continuing. So I haven't had to delay any project or say this won't happen because of the National Children's Hospital. That's thanks to the collective work of Cabinet colleagues and the work of Paschal Donoghue, Minister Donoghue, in that regard. Can I get you a note in relation to the individual health identifier and the e-health records, just in terms, my Secretary General is writing an updated note for me here as we speak, but it will be rolled out obviously in phases, but I would like to send you a detailed note in relation to that, Chair. Did I miss a question?
In relation to the funding towards cervical check and the rollout of HPV testing.
Thank you very much. So yes, there is funding this year for HPV testing. It has been allocated in budget 2019. I think what Dr. Doherty and Mr. McCallion would have told the committee last week, is that they are working to come up with a definitive timeline. We're working towards Q4 2019. That is going to be challenging. There are a couple of moving parts here, the big one being the tender, but we have the funding. I am working for it to be delivered this year. The HSE are very clear that is the policy direction. I think they would have confirmed that last week at the committee as well. I think it is important to say that we still will be amongst one of the first countries in the world to make this transition, not the first. So there are a number that have done it, including the Netherlands and Australia, and there's a number of stages. So I expect to receive a definitive timeline from the HSE in the next couple of weeks on this, but it is still, everyone is working as hard as they possibly can to try and bring it in by the end of the year.
So what you're saying, Minister, is money has been allocated to fund it should a contract or a provider be
and
identified?
and without being in any way smart or dismissive, because we all know what happened, but money was allocated last year as well, so the money is allocated to deliver this year.
Because HPV testing was to come in October of 2018.
18, absolutely.
And the likelihood is it won't come in until, at the very earliest,
Q4
Q4 2019.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And just in relation to slaughter care and the transitional funding, do you expect to create a transitional fund in the budget for 2020?
Yes, I
in
do.
relation to slaughter care, over and above the integration fund?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. That'll be my... So I think I had... And I suppose we haven't been able to discuss this before because we've been in negotiations with GPs, but I think we had considerable success in securing a very large investment pot, if you like, for general practice. GPs will rightly say some of it was giving back the money that they lost during the difficult years. Of that, there's no doubt, but it's still quite a bit above that. It's €210 million. So that was, I suppose, one of the big asks that I'd been working on with the Department of Public Expenditure Reform and the Department of the Taoiseach. Now that we have that in place and we have that secured, the issue of a transition fund will very much be a priority for me in the next budget.
And in relation to the reprofiling of the capital plan, 100 million extra was required for the National Children's Hospital this year. 220 million will be required in 2020, 2021 and 2022. Where do you see that funding coming from? Is it going to come from the health capital plan, or is it going to be spread across other departments?
They're matters for the government to make as a collective on the recommendation of Minister Donoghue, and the government hasn't taken a decision in that regard, so it would be at the very least imprudent of me to speculate, but I would imagine the government will adopt a kind of common sense approach that we tried to adopt this year, but these are decisions for Minister Donoghue to make, and he'll make them in due course. What I'm endeavouring to do, working with his department, is see if we can publish a 2 or 3 year iteration of what capital looks like in health. And I think that would be really important because it would allow us to get a number of projects underway. There's a lot of projects that we want to get underway in health that the expenditure at the start is quite small. You know, tendering, design, planning, but you need to do it for when you're getting ready to actually build that, whether it's an extension to a hospital or a new primary care centre. So I'll be better able to answer some of those questions in the coming weeks.
And just one final question in relation to the Slaughter Care Integration Fund. There, in the briefing document, it outlines 4 different streams.
Yes.
Perhaps you could just expand on those 4 different streams.
I can indeed. So these 4 streams are all areas where Slaughter Care is very much pivoted. So I mean, it's what we're basically doing is we're asking, rather than telling from the top down what we believe you should be doing in the local health organisation, we're asking hospitals, we're asking community health organisations, and we're asking indeed voluntary organisations, what do you believe you could do? So we know, you tell me this all the time, people tell me this as we go around the country all the time. You know, I have a really good project down here, I could take some people off the waiting list, or I could actually work better with the local hospital if I was able to get that bit of technology. So we've set out the actual, I think there's 5 actual streams. Right care, right place, right time. So what more can you do? These are the objectives of the scheme, rather. The scaling of current successful integration projects, patient-centred improvement projects, cross-agency collaboration, and changing the model of care. And you're right, there's 4 funding streams linked to each of those actions. The first is scaling and sharing existing examples of best practice and process for chronic disease management and care for older people. So you might be, as an organisation or the health service, you might be doing something really good in your community, looking after older people with diabetes, as an example. And you might believe for extra investment we could actually scale that up. Or we're a different part of the country, we could replicate that here. Funding stream 2 is supporting scaling and sharing existing examples of best practice approaches to reduce waiting time for consultation and treatment. The example, I think, I'm not preempting these, I'm just giving people examples for illustrative reasons. We all talk about the Sligo eye model, where they did a really, really good job taking a lot of eye procedures and eye outpatient appointments out of the hospital into the community. Could that be scaled up? We know it worked in that part of the country. Why doesn't it work in my part of the country? The third one is supporting digital innovation, including patient access to health information. So again, have you a way of using technology to improve the delivery of health service? The new GP contract, for example, or the new addendum to the GP contract suggests, for example, virtual clinics could be held. We have 1 in the country at the moment on cardiology, commits to another 4, where consultants and GPs interact about individual patients. So have you a digital solution to help implement Slaughter Care? And the last is supporting new approaches in the community, industry and voluntary sectors. So again, we shouldn't believe that the public health service has all the answers, because a lot of our health service is being delivered by voluntary operators. So people are being invited to pitch, to send in these ideas. I think they have until about the 18th of April, another little bit of time to send in the ideas, and I'd expect we'll allocate the funding in the month of May.
So can I take it from that then that the HSE are the only nominating body for the first 3 streams, and the 4th stream is open to other organisations?
No, I suppose it's fair to say the 4th stream is probably more applicable to other organisations, but you can apply as a voluntary organisation on any of the streams. Okay. Yeah, any of the streams. I suppose the 4th is nearly non-HSE specific, but non-HSE people aren't ruled out from the other 3.
Okay. Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I am now going to ask Deputy Lisa Chambers, who is substituting for Margaret Murphy-O'Mahony.
Thank you very much,
Deputy
Chair.
Chambers.
I appreciate that we are here to discuss the estimates, but I'm going to focus on cervical check and that it does have an impact on the health budget, obviously. Minister, on the last occasion when you were before the committee, I asked you a question around the decision to offer the free out-of-cycle smears and who gave you that advice. After pressing you for a little while, you said it was my idea, but that it was supported and agreed by the Chief Medical Officer to do that. Minister, I put it to you that there was no caveat attaching to that. The question being asked at the time was a blanket free offer to any woman that wanted one. And you said in this committee that the Chief Medical Officer supported what was essentially your idea, your decision, and that nobody else advised you to do that you came up with this decision yourself. But obviously, new evidence has come to light that the Chief Medical Officer did not support a free blanket offer of smear tests to absolutely everybody.
Sorry, Deputy Chambers, this question has already been asked earlier.
It's actually not a question, I'm just kind of framing my next question, I suppose.
Okay.
Because my question to that is, do you still stand over the evidence you gave to the committee on that day, that your decision was supported by the Chief Medical Officer in light of Ms Flanley's evidence? And also my question to you as well is, can you tell the committee what advice Tony O'Brien gave you on Sunday the 29th of April?
Yes, so just a couple of things. So I did answer some of this before, but I welcome the chance to answer it again. Just to be clear, and I'm somewhat uneasy with other people speaking or suggesting that they're speaking for my Chief Medical Officer. The Chief Medical Officer in my department and myself are ad idem with this, as are my officials, and you don't actually have to take my word for it, Deputy Chambers, because my department at an official level, not me, my department at an official level wrote to the County Court of this House in response to your party leader's parliamentary questions. I think the letter went around the 12th of February, but certainly in the month of February. And as I quoted to Deputy Donnelly earlier, in the letter it says, in fact, the Minister's decision and announcement on the 28th of April were consistent with the advice received from his officials, and the advice of the Chief Medical Officer to the Minister was reflected in the press statement that issued on the 28th of April. So I'll certainly get on to the Dr Flannelly and Mr O'Brien question now, but to be very, very clear, the Chief Medical Officer supported the decision that I made. We were, as I said earlier, our text messages were even FOI'd and published in a newspaper. We were in very, very regular contact in relation to this. He and I and my department believed it was the appropriate thing to do, not in a normal time, but in these exceptional times. There was never, and you used the word evidence, there was never evidence that I intended to provide a blanket offer. I don't even know what that phrase blanket offer means, because women, and I don't need to explain to any woman, but smear tests are carried out by healthcare professionals. Women go to see healthcare professionals. And what actually happened, there was only ever one decision implemented. My department, there was a lot of focus on my tweet. My department tweeted as well moments later and also outlined how the process would work. A press statement was issued from my department that night. A fee was agreed with GPs. 110,000 women went to their GP. Only 57,000 of them decided to get the repeat smear after that engagement with their GP. But I think it would be wrong, you haven't said it today, but others have said it in recent days, it would be wrong to suggest that they were unnecessary when a woman and her GP decided together that was the appropriate course of action in 57,000, but not in the other 50% of times. In relation to, you asked me about Mr O'Brien. I don't recall Mr O'Brien, and that's not to say he didn't, by the way, because he may well have, and I presume you're referencing the Marion Finucane show interview. I think Mr O'Brien said that he believed he told me that we should walk it back. Don't recall that conversation. Perhaps he did. Your party at the time was planning on backing a motion of no confidence to remove him from his job. So that was how you and your party viewed him in his position at that time. But I took, you went on Drive Time Radio, Deputy Donnelly, and reversed your position and said you'd be voting to remove Mr O'Brien in an unprecedented move from office. And,
Not at that time we didn't.
maybe a couple of days later, but that was how you were viewing the Director General of the HSE.
You've no idea how we were reviewing the Director General at that time.
You had no confidence.
You didn't state that.
Allow the Minister to continue.
Yeah, I'm not sure who's actually asking questions here, but I'm
Just
just
correcting
pointing
the
out.
record.
I'm pointing out you wanted Mr. O'Brien to resign from his job in relation to the cervical check tobacco, which I did.
Sorry, I know there's a bit of a thing going on here, but just I am.
No, not a thing going on. There's just been lots of misinformation put out there in recent days.
I would agree with you on that, actually. Yeah.
I'm sure you do, for different reasons. But so I don't recall Mr. O'Brien having a conversation with me. That is not to say that he didn't. He with many conversations. The reality of the situation is I take my medical advice from the Chief Medical Officer. He's a doctor. He's the Chief Medical Officer. I had lost confidence. I don't wish to speak for you. I presume you had. I think certainly most women in the country had, and most politicians had, in the management of cervical check. I had expressed no confidence in it. I was taking my advice from my department officials who stepped up to the plate and were doing a superb job in the middle of a major public health crisis of confidence. And that's where I took my advice from. The moment I received, because I've heard this put forward to Deputy Chambers, the moment I received advice from my officials to stop was in October. I accepted that advice on that day, and we communicated our decision to the HSE on that day in writing. This is all there in writing, and the HSE said they wanted to continue it for operational reasons till the end of December, which was logical because people had booked their tests. So when my officials advised me to stop the test, which was after the publication of the Dr. Scally report, we stopped it immediately. We conveyed our decision to stop it immediately.
Yeah, you actually stopped it 2 months later. But
the HSE stopped it 2 months later. I conveyed my decision to the HSE. The HSE said women had already booked in and please to allow them have those appointments.
Minister, on the last occasion I asked you that prior to taking that decision, and there's making the decision and then there's communicating the decision, so there's a timeline there as well.
Yep.
And also prior to taking the memo to Cabinet on the 1st of May, I asked you, did anybody advise you against that decision or warn of any potential problems? And you answered, not to my recollection. And I said, not one voice, and you said, not to my recollection. That's becoming less credible, I think, as time moves on. It does appear there were communications to your department from cervical check. It does appear that Tony O'Brien, his evidence and his word is that he asked you to walk it back or pull back from that decision. So it's not just one individual saying that there was advice that this could go wrong or this could have negative consequences for the programme. There are multiple voices, and I believe you heard those voices before the Cabinet memo was brought on the 1st of May. That still doesn't answer the question why, after making that decision, have you not consulted with cervical check, just basically directing them, this is my decision, not looking at the capacity, the resources. It's pretty obvious, even if you're not the Minister for Health, if you're just an ordinary citizen, that if you make an offer of this nature, you're going to increase demand. That's pretty obvious.
Sure. To
make that decision without considering capacity and resources was reckless, is my view on that. You would probably disagree with that, I'm sure.
I do.
Cervical check, when they were in this committee last week, they were being asked about the new HPV screening programme, and regrettably that's now looking as though it could be 2020, 2021 before that comes into being. When pushed on why that was not being brought sooner, made available sooner, the answer I was given is that decisions of this nature must be based on clinical evidence and they must be safe. My view is that your decision to offer what I consider to be a blanket free out-of-cycle smear regardless, because that's what your tweet did say. And Minister, my view on Twitter is that if you choose to use that to communicate a message, you are responsible for how that's taken up. And perhaps it's not the best way for a Cabinet Minister to conduct their affairs, but that's a matter for yourself.
Would you give up Twitter if you're in Cabinet?
Not by giving it up, Minister, but the point is you're responsible for what you tweet, is my point on that.
Yes, exactly.
But it is not credible that not one dissenting voice made its way to your ear before the 1st of May. That's my view on it. And what I find completely incredible is that you didn't review that decision until October. October? So May, June, July, August, September. We've 5 months. Where on the last occasion when you were before this committee, you said you were engaging with cervical check almost on a fortnightly basis. So you would have been aware, you said yourself, I would have been aware of the backlog when it arose. That backlog was quite evident from at least August onwards. And you decided to do nothing. And I know you're going to say Scally report. I don't really care about the Scally report right now, because at the same time, that doesn't stop you from doing your job. You're not bound by the Scally report, and nor can you hide behind it. If that backlog was evident to you, at least in August, we'll give you that much. How did you leave it until October to make the call to end the free out-of-cycle smears. And you only made that call because Cervical Check wrote to you on October 21st to say, please stop, you're crashing the system. And even then, when you made the decision, it wasn't implemented until December. So not only did you make a bad decision initially for the wrong reasons because you were under political pressure, you made it without the proper advice. You didn't consult the actual organisation that were going to carry out your promise, which I can't understand that. Even if you had no confidence in them, the free smears that you were giving out were being sent to Cervical Check anyways. So that makes no sense. If you're saying you didn't have confidence and you didn't want to consult them, but you had no problem directing another 100,000 women to their doors, that doesn't add up. But to go a full 5 months without reviewing your decision, knowing the backlog was building, I don't know how you can stand behind that inaction. And that inaction allowed that backlog to build and build and build, and you still have a sort of capacity. So can you just outline to me how you can justify waiting until October to make that decision? And whatever about not implementing it until December because people have booked in, you could have actually dealt with those that were already booked rather than taking new bookings. So I don't buy that either, quite frankly. But why did you wait so long? And if your answer is Scally report, as you did on the last occasion, keep it brief, please.
Thanks very much.
Minister.
Well, you'll understand why I take my advice in relation to whether it was a good or a bad decision from other sources and opposition politicians. The President of the National Association of General Practitioners, someone you and your party quote quite regularly in relation to being an expert view on primary care, again this week, and I won't take the committee's time repeating what I already read into the record at earlier stages, but repeating that he believed it was the right decision because many, many women were sitting in front of GPs looking for reassurance, and GPs were put in an impossible position, and that if I hadn't taken that decision, confidence in the screening programme would have dwindled further. You and I have a different view on this. I reckon we're always going to have a different view on this, but I take a source of reassurance that my decision was appropriate considering the exceptional times that we're in, based on what I hear from GPs and based on what I hear from women who did avail of this. You have a different view in relation to that. I appreciate that. There does seem to be a premise to your question that had I not offered this, women weren't going to seek it anyway.
I didn't say that, and I don't agree with that.
But okay, well, you talk about I tweeted and created all this demand and capacity. Women were already going to their GP. So women were turning up at their GP. They were looking for reassurance, 110,000 of them. Mm-hmm. I made the decision, not just about the repeat smear, but a free visit to your GP. So the free, which was different, by the way, to the normal screening service protocol. Free visit to your GP, consultation with your GP, and then if your GP believes you need the repeat smear, 110,000 women took that up. You know, they didn't take it up because they listened to every word I say. They took it up because they wanted to talk to their GP. And they had that. So I believe that was the right thing to do. I genuinely do. I believe women would have gone otherwise. I believe women who could afford to go were going anyway. I've heard from many women who went private anyway. So this was a case of who was going to pay, and were we going to allow women who could afford to have it and others who couldn't. Now, many in opposition called on me to do just this. Many in your own party called on me to do just this. Many opposition spokespeople on health called on me to do this and maintain the position that was, they criticised me for many things, that this was still the right decision. Others take a different view. I don't hide behind the Scally report, just to be really, really clear in relation to this. The point I'm making was we arrived at a point where we could provide that much needed reassurance in our screening service when Dr. Scally's report came. And that's why it aligns with when my officials suggested that we would then stop the thing. I'm going to take your criticism on the October to December piece, because I think there could be some validity in that. I need to reflect further on why the HSE decided that they believe, to go to December. Could that have been handled better? I have an open mind on that. You may have a degree of legitimate criticism of me in relation to that issue, but I genuinely will never believe, and I reckon we'll never agree, I'll never believe that this was the wrong decision. I'll believe it was the right decision taken in a very difficult time for good reasons based on listening to women and GPs. It has absolutely caused a capacity problem, there's no doubt about that, and I've discussed it with your party colleague here. Our priority has to be on finding the capacity. The HSE did, I think, signal good progress on that last week when they were before the committee. They have now identified potential extra capacity. I use the word potential because until it's over the line, that's what it is, Deputy Chambers, and women will want to know more than potential. I take that point too. I expect them to be back very shortly, certainly by kind of the end of the month, with an update in relation to where we're at in that regard. And if we can bring that on board, and I'm hopeful, we will clear the backlog and clear it quickly.
Minister, you probably you didn't really deal with why you didn't review until October, because you're saying that we were waiting for the Scally report and that was the point at which we had reassurance in the labs, but you were still sending women to the same labs and the same service. So that doesn't, for me, that doesn't add up, but I guess we won't get any further on that issue today.
Sure, I wasn't sending women anywhere though. Women were going to their GP.
Actually, the HSE have attributed 2/3 of the increase to that offer. Okay, so
Yes.
that's the HSE are saying that.
That's
not
true.
me saying it.
That's true.
Not opposition politicians.
No,
that's
that's
your
true.
department and the HSE are saying
And
this.
that's true.
The HSE haven't really given positive signals around capacity. We're a year on since the promise was given, since the offer was made. There's no extra capacity there. So, and you pointed about women going to private operators to pay privately.
Yeah.
The point was made, I think, by Stephen Donnelly at the last occasion that shows there's capacity somewhere
Yes.
if you pay for it. And the question is still there: why can't the HSE buy it? If private individuals can source it, why can't the HSE source it? And the delay in sourcing that extra capacity leaves an awful lot to be desired, Minister, on that front. My final questions, Chair, are. I was going to ask when is the backlog going to be cleared. I think we could be looking at the next year or two because it's such an utter mess. More specifically around MedLab, are they terminating their agreement with the HSE and when is that happening? And what's happening to the smears already, the slides already gone to MedLab, and what's happening to the workload that they currently have?
Yeah.
And Minister, you in the last couple of days referred to triage being used. Can you just explain what you mean by that? Are you saying that anybody that presented for a repeat reassurance smear, that if there is a history there, and what history constitutes, where does that put you in terms of 1, 2 or 3? Can you just explain the triage element of it?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. Just the issue of capacity, what I meant by positivity was that the HSE and particularly, I can single out Damien McCallion, who was before this committee last week, have worked night and day to try and identify additional capacity. They have assured me that it's not an issue of funding, it's an issue of a shortage of cytology around the globe. For the first time last week, they have said publicly at this committee and indeed to me in meetings that they have now identified extra capacity. And as we speak, and I mean literally as we speak this week, there are intensive engagements to try and bring that capacity on board. I can't go any further than that because I don't want to jeopardise that, but I'm hopeful. I've been very clear to them that obviously that has to, not that I need it to be because they get this, but that it needs to obviously comply with Scally in terms of quality assurance. So there's a conversation going on to make sure all of that happens. Just the point you made, and it's a very fair point, and it's a point that hopefully we can agree on this one, in relation to the issue of MedLab. I mean, that does show that some labs have capacity available. The issue is they don't want to do business with the Irish Public Health Service. And I think that's something we need to, I'm sorry, I'm not speaking for MedLab, but that's something I think we need to reflect on. In the aftermath of the cervical check debacle, there were some laboratories that made the decision, I'm out of Ireland, I don't want to do any more business with Ireland. I can't speak for them as to why that is, but it does perhaps go back to some of the comments in the Scally report in relation to the debacle. My understanding, Deputy, and I will confirm this to you in writing, but just to be sure, but my understanding is that MedLab have a legal responsibility, or indeed any lab does, to any slide that they've taken, so that they do have a legal responsibility to what they've processed. I'm reluctant to go further because there's ongoing discussions that I don't wish to jeopardise, and I know you don't either. But I am confident that if the HSE can get their discussions over the line and their negotiations over the line, there will be additional capacity in the programme above and beyond any decision that any individual lab may make. In relation to the triaging, and you're right, this is a phrase that I have used, and I've used it to try and provide reassurance because there was a viewpoint and an understandable viewpoint out there that if you or a woman had an additional risk, that you were kind of just sitting in a queue along with everybody else. I've been informed that in the labs that there is a backlog, and you know the particular lab that there is a backlog, that they're now triaging people on the basis of medical history. I'd feel more comfortable if I could get you a note that I could share with the committee outlining that, and I'll get you that today or tomorrow, just outlining exactly how that process works so that I don't articulate it incorrectly. I'd like a clinician to write that letter, but that's my understanding, is that they do triage people on the basis of medical history.
Just a clarification point on that. MedLab is servicing rural parts of the country, so if you're living in County Mayo,
Yes.
where I live,
Yep.
you are waiting 8 and 9 months, far longer than anybody else. So it's of particular concern to women living in that particular region, that the one lab that has the biggest backlog is now looking to pull out. And I think we need reassurance from you, Minister, as to how that's going to work, particularly for those women that are already in the system. On the triage, the reason I ask you for this is that I'm not convinced that's actually happening.
Okay.
If I'm being honest,
Right.
I'd ask you to look into that. And I asked you if you could clarify, and particularly you don't have the answer now, but what constitutes a history that might send a red flag that this person needs to get their results back? Because I would question that's happening, and I say that because I have certain information that I don't wish to disclose at the meeting, but I just ask you to check that.
Yes, certainly I'll check that, and certainly happy to discuss privately with you as well, but I'll check that and I'll come back to you in writing on that.
Thank you.
I fully accept the bona fides of the reasons you're raising these issues, and that it is a particular challenge in your part of the country for the reasons you outlined. I fully accept that. My very clear understanding, as I said, is that there's a legal responsibility on the lab that has the test, if you like, to complete the test. And what I would say to you and those you represent in Mayo and that part of the country is that I'm very conscious of the fact that we have 3 labs we're using, if you like, or 3 organisations. The CUM doesn't really seem to have a backlog. It's processing them in about 3 weeks. Quest, from my memory, kind of 7 to 9 weeks, and a very significant one in MedLab.
33.
What I'm telling you, 33, absolutely. What I'm telling you today, and I'm telling you honestly, is that the HSE are actively involved in trying to find additional capacity to rectify that problem. And I'll revert to you and the committee as a whole as soon as I have further news on that.
Thank you. Minister, before I bring Donnelly again to start a second round of questioning, the issue that arose last April in relation to cervical check surrounded non-disclosure of the audit. And the audit was the icing on the cake, if you like, for screening programmes, that they now wished to look back on people who had been identified as having cancer to see if their previous smear had been accurate. And it was the non-disclosure of the audit results to those women that led to the controversy that raged at the end of April last year. Now, you expressed a lack of confidence in cervical check management, but really you were, I assume you were expressing a lack of confidence in that element of the programme.
Yes.
But unfortunately, your expression of no confidence in cervical check management led to the lack of confidence in women in the programme in general, in the whole process of the programme. And that's what led to the demand for an out-of-cycle smear. But really, the issue was non-disclosure of the audit as opposed to the actual working of the programme, which was a very is and will be a very successful programme. And as Deputy O'Connell mentioned, 65,000 women are now walking around having had early changes identified and treated successfully. So it was the expression of no confidence in cervical check that led to the controversy. Is that one of the errors that you have admitted to making? Was that one of the critical errors that you made?
No, I'll maybe to answer the question a different way. The error I think I made, and I've spoken about this before, and I'm not sure it would have worked, by the way, if I had tried this, but I will regret and will always regret, however long I'm in politics and after politics, that I didn't request a bit of time. So we were operating, and I have to take the findings of the Scally report too. Now, I'd respectfully suggest they're more broadly applicable in this House to just me, right? But I'm willing to accept my part. I think what needed to happen was I needed to say to people, can we just take a couple of days on this? This is not a go at anyone, right? It's the way this place works. The idea that I was in the Dáil chamber and being handed new information as I was walking into the chamber, and then presented with this dilemma: do I tell the Dáil? And if I tell the Dáil, I'm going to cause worry. If I don't tell the Dáil, then the Dáil will say I misled them. So this frenzied environment. But I'm the minister, and I should have tried to call a halt. I remain to be convinced it would have worked. But I should have tried to. Look, I don't wish to talk about people who aren't here, but I do wish to say this, and it's a positive. I mean, Dr. Gráinne Flannelly has done so much good work for screening in our country and for tackling cervical cancer, and that should never ever be taken from her or the people who worked in the management. And on this I agree with Deputy Martin, and I've heard him talk about this. These people helped build our screening programme, they helped build it with predecessors in mind, and they've saved lives. Where I couldn't have confidence, and it didn't really matter whether I did or not, because quite frankly women didn't, was that an audit was overseen that was botched. And if you were in my position on those days, Chairman, I mean, asking basic questions and not being able to get the answers. How many other people are in Vicky Phelan's situation? And the inability of that organisation to give me that information fed into the general worry, which I suppose is some of the issues that Deputy Chambers and I have just discussed at some length. So I continue to reflect on a very regular basis about cervical check and what could have been done better by me, by my department, by the HSE, by this institution, and indeed by media and public commentary. I think there's lessons for all of us. I accept my parsonage for definite. But I also very clearly in my ears hear the words of the patient advocates who are saying, that's all grand, but can we now get on with making sure something good comes out of this and try and eradicate this awful disease? Can I just on the audit, because I thought you were going to ask this, but now that you nearly did, I'd like to just answer the question. One of Dr. Scally's key recommendations was that the audit should be paused. And I think that was entirely appropriate. Audit is a good thing, a really good thing, but this one was obviously not executed in any way that was appropriate. So he did call on it to be paused. I did read in a newspaper, I think on a front page of a newspaper, I did read a medical negligence lawyer suggesting that the programme had been paused to stop future litigation. Just to be clear, the audit has been paused for no reason other than to implement Dr. Scally's report and address the concerns expressed by women. We have now established an expert group which is meeting to work out how do you properly design an audit that works for women and that works for the programme, and that work is underway, and the auditing will be recommenced then, but in a way that women, and indeed these lessons will be broader than just women, patients in general can have confidence in.
Yes.
Just for a 60-second break.
Oh yeah. Well, is it okay if we go for a 10-minute break?
No, if we need to break, let's break. Oh yeah, break. Yeah.
Break for
sure.
15 minutes.
I just
5 minutes, Chair.
Yeah, 5 is fine.
We're good. Yeah, 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. Thank you. We will resume in public session if that's agreed.
Agreed.
So we're going to start our second round of questioning now, which might be somewhat shorter than the first round.
Your very best, Chair.
Thank you very much.
This here.
So Deputy Donnelly,
Thank you.
lead off. Thank you.
Minister, just on a procedural issue, or Chair, the Minister has referenced that he has an email that many of us have been looking for. Can you make that available today to the committee?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll do that now. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Secondly, Minister, a comment probably more for Mr Breslin than for yourself. The Parliamentary Budgetary Office did an excellent piece of work in preparing the committee to look at the estimates. And actually, one of the main findings they come to is that it's impossible to do a decent scrutiny because the numbers are non-comparable. They say there is a number of challenges in undertaking effective scrutiny of this money. It's a €17 billion pot of money. And my ask is, and I've looked at what the Parliamentary Budgetary Office has said, and I have to say I agree with them. They say between the figures we're looking at today, which we're meant to be able to compare to the figures from December, it's essentially impossible to do so because the headings are not like for like. They talk about a figure of 400 million on pensions that got pulled out a lot of areas and dropped into another one, and a lot of other issues. And so could I ask, and I'm aware that this is not a small amount of work, but could I ask that the department read the Parliamentary Budgetary Office's report and come back to give a report back to the committee, taking these issues on board so that we can actually properly scrutinise the estimates, as that's what we're here for today. Is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely. So my officials will take a look at that and see how it compares with our briefing note and how we can feature something further. No problem.
Minister, you don't need to respond to this. I just want to reflect, and I'm going to move on now to the estimates of the National Children's Hospital. But I just, finally on cervical check, I heard you say to Deputy Chambers that you believe, knowing what you know now, that it was the right decision. It was the right decision to make. Minister, your department was told at a senior level, at a principal officer level, that your decision would crash the system. You were repeatedly told throughout the year that your decision was crashing the system, and indeed we are now dealing with the results of the system having been crashed. And we have 80,000 women waiting up to 8 months, and we have hundreds of thousands of women waiting for HPV test. I would put it to you that to state at this stage that your decision was the right decision is extraordinary, and in my opinion is an insult to all of those women. Now, we don't need to get back into it. We've had a good go at it. If you want to respond, fine. But then we want to move on to the Children's Hospital.
Very briefly, I do. I don't, and I'll give you the email. I've already given you the content of the email. You know, the email says, named individual, having spoken to Jerome and Grania, it's important we make you aware of some key risks arising from such an open access policy. It then lists the risks, all of which were readily identifiable to my department, and indeed to anyone. Of course, if you do this, you're going to have to work out how to pay the GPs. Of course, it will result in additional smears being taken. But it also goes on to say it's understood we take direction from the department. So the phrase crashing the system is one that I've only heard you use, and I don't mean that disrespectfully.
Well, the exact wording we got from Dr. Flannelly was, and I quote, fundamentally undermine the system and lead to delays. So,
that's not
in anybody's language, that is.
But that's not the word. So I mean, I didn't receive, and my Secretary General told this committee, as did the Director General of the HSE tell this committee, that I didn't receive any contrary advice in relation to this decision prior to making the decision. But the overriding point I make is the unique circumstances in which we were faced. This was going to arise, and there's probably, as in women were going to seek repeat smear tests. It was how we dealt with that was the issue. But
just to the Minister, and I accept your point, but the HSC contradicts that. The HSC clearly states that there was a narrative, your narrative, which of course you're entitled to, which is it was going to happen anyway, so we made it free. There's two conflicting narratives, one directly from the HSC to this committee that says that's not true. They directly attribute 2/3 of the backlog to your offer. They don't say it was going to happen anyway. No, they do, Minister. And the other thing is that no one was disagreeing with it being made free where appropriate. The big error appears to have been in this open offer. The department very quickly caveated that and said, in consultation with GPs, You didn't, and I think that is.
But you're still criticising the decision. Then I don't accept the difference, because there isn't a difference between the Chief Medical Officer and myself on this matter. But you're still criticising that decision, which you still believe is wrong.
No, what I am saying, Minister, is I am taking exception with you saying now that you believed it was the right decision at the time. Of course you did. That you made the decision. That's absolutely fine. I find it extraordinary that you would state now, given that there's 80,000 women around the country waiting up to 8 or 9 months, and hundreds of thousands of women waiting for this HPV test, which you said would be in last September, and which we're now told may not even be in this calendar year. I find it extraordinary, given that your decision is directly linked to that. We also had evidence last week that there was no medical benefit. It was about reassuring people. There was no medical benefit to it. I find it extraordinary that now, knowing everything we know, and indeed with the evidence from the committee, that you were repeatedly asked to stop because it was causing these delays or fundamentally undermining the system, as was warned, that today you would still say it was the right decision. That's the only.
So you can only make a decision at a point in time, and the time I made the decision, I believe it was the appropriate decision. You and I have a different view on this.
Thank you. Minister, I want to move on to the National Children's Hospital and PwC. Just quickly on a procedural point, though not a small one. Several weeks ago, the Dáil passed a motion, accepted by you and your government by an overwhelming majority, to include in the PwC report an analysis of the implications for cost and timing of moving the site. And I wrote to you directly after that and asked that that be done. It wasn't included in the PwC report. Can I ask, did you instruct PwC further to the Dáil vote on same to include the cost and timing implications of potentially moving the site?
It's an important question, and I'll have to check in terms of what conversations took place with PwC, because I didn't have any directly with them. But certainly I did accept the Dáil motion, because I believed it was an honest attempt by you to make sure we had robust terms of reference, and I accepted a number of your changes and suggestions to the terms of reference. I don't accept, though, and I've been listening to you comment on this a little bit over the last day, I don't accept that we can presume that PwC didn't look at this, because PwC do say on page 8 to take any other decision would have cost more. So I'm not sure we can presume that PwC didn't consider had we moved to a different site. I'm not sure we can take that. I'll be meeting the report's authors in the coming days, and I'll certainly tease that out further and come back to you on it, Deputy.
Okay, thank you. Just to be clear, what we were looking for PwC to do was not ascertain back in September of last year what the implications might have been. The direct call from the Dáil was for the government to instruct PwC to include an analysis as of now, because a number of paediatricians and parents of sick children and concerned citizens around the country believe that it is still the right thing to do. Now, I will be surprised if the analysis comes back and backs that up, but out of respect for those people and their very strongly held view, and who knows, they may not be wrong, the Dáil called on that analysis to be included in the PwC report.
Yeah, so I'll discuss that with the PwC
okay,
authors.
But can you confirm that
and revert to you?
If after the Dáil vote, it was only about 3 weeks ago, did you instruct your officials to contact PwC to include that analysis? Because it was essentially an additional term of reference we were adding in.
Yeah, I just need to seek clarity on that, Deputy, so as not to mislead you. I do need to make the point that these were financial auditors, and obviously the decision to locate the site, and nor has anyone ever suggested it was, is not entirely a financial decision. There are different views. I accept there's different views. There's people watching this who will have different views, but the decision was taken on a number of views, including clinical and medical reasons. And the Dáil did vote, talking about Dáil votes, the Dáil did vote, you and I voted in 2012 to endorse the James's, sorry, I actually don't know what way you voted, I'm not presuming you did, but I certainly voted to endorse the James's decision in the Dáil in 2012 as a backbench TD, and I would have voted again as Minister for Health, I think in 2017, on a private member's motion to re-endorse that decision. So we did vote twice on the site.
Thank you.
But I'll go back to you.
I want to move on to the guaranteed maximum price, because it potentially has a huge implication on this year's costings estimates. This committee was told repeatedly, both, not by you, but by the Development Board and by the Department of Health, that the great advantage of this two-stage process was that the state now had a guaranteed maximum price, and that any future cost overruns would now be borne by the contractor. That was the single biggest offence given to this committee for this ill-fated two-stage process. The PwC report blows that completely out of the water. It says it's complete nonsense. In fact, 9 of the 11 recommendations go to controlling further cost escalation that it clearly says is on the state. Can you explain why, on this huge issue, we could be talking about hundreds of millions of additional spend required on behalf of the state? Can you explain this massive discrepancy between what the department and the development board believe or believed, which was that the guaranteed maximum price was exactly that, what we all understood it to be and what they told us it was, and PwC saying that is complete nonsense. The state is potentially still on the hook for hundreds of millions in additional spend.
Sure. So I think they're two separate issues. So on page 4 of the report, the PwC do comment in relation to the two-stage process. And I think it's fair to say, Deputy, that a lot of people raised a lot of questions. Was it the right process to use? And it's one of the things PwC looked at. They did say, and I'm quoting from the report now, the two-stage procurement process used to award the contract for construction of the National Children's Hospital is a widely used approach, and it can deliver significant benefit in relation to accelerating project timelines. So it didn't say it was the wrong approach, right? It did not say, and many of us perhaps thought it might, but it didn't come back and say it was the wrong procurement approach. What it did say, and here's the criticism, the necessary controls required to mitigate those risks and consequences of this approach were not put in place. So my view of the reading of the PwC, with less than 24 hours since it landed, in terms of me getting access to it, my view of the PwC report is that it says the procurement approach, we can see benefits to why you'd use the two-stage, but the execution was appalling.
Sir, just in the interest of time, Minister, I'm
Sure.
not asking you about the two-stage approach. I'm saying that the department and the board came in here and told us that the state now had a guaranteed maximum price.
Which is the two-stage approach.
Well, it's the result of the two-stage approach.
Okay.
But the important point is we were told that any future cost escalations essentially were going to be on the contractor. The PwC have said that is complete nonsense and that future cost escalations are on the Irish people. Can you explain why there is such a total divergence of views between your department and the development board on the one hand on what the guaranteed maximum price actually means and what PwC have just told us it means?
Sure. So I don't think it's entirely accurate to say that my department came in and said there was no further risk to the taxpayer from the guaranteed maximum price, because that's not what government was appraised of, nor it's, and I could even look back at my own comments in the committee, there was always residual risk, particularly flagged in relation to further user changes, but also in relation to the issue of inflation. So I think it is fair to say that some additional residual risk was always highlighted. So I don't think it's a total divergence. So for example, user changes to the project were always exempt from the GMP. Things outside our control, without bringing Brexit into everything. PwC even references the risk from Brexit in terms of access to supplies. So I suppose it would be.
There's still a pretty big divergence between what we were told and what this report says.
I think, I mean, the way I'd articulate it is there's still far too much risk about future cost rises to this project. And what PwC does say, and you asked us to ask them, was there a way of reducing the cost of the project? And what they basically came back and said, yeah, there might be technical ways of doing that, but really you actually should be getting the board to put their effort into reducing the risk of further cost rises arising from this. So I think that's where the focus now needs to be. I do need to make the point though, people always ask, what will the final cost of this project be? It's a perfectly valid or legitimate question. If you used a traditional procurement model, you wouldn't actually have been able to determine the final actual cost until after the project completed and the claims came in. So it is normal, even in any project, if you look at the cost of the Lewis building, and claims come in at the end. So if you bring in an auditor and you say, can you say absolutely definitively that there's no further risk of cost rise, you're probably not going to find an auditor in the world that would say that.
Can I go on? You reference cost reduction opportunities, and it was one of the big disappointments of the report to me. So in 128 pages, only 2 pages was given over to that, and indeed one of those pages was mainly a pie chart. I don't accept PwC's findings on this. I think the report is strong in some areas. I think it's very weak here, because essentially what they say is, look, 85% of the total cost is already contracted, therefore essentially there's nothing you can do about that. Now, again, as anyone who's ever built a wall or an extension or a house or a large building will know, that as costs escalate, you can sit down with your developer or your builder or your project manager or your architect or whatever it is and say, look, these costs are getting completely out of control. Yes, we have a contract in place for you to build the following, but we need to rein that back in again. And PwC have essentially said, in this case, the biggest capital spend in the history of the state, you can't do that. Now, BAM stated that they would walk away. My understanding is that they would be more than open to look at the contract and say, well, look, we're going to do a value engineering project. We're going to pull costs out of this. This building, for example, is about as expensive a shape as you can imagine. It's a big glass donut shape. There's a reason none of us live in glass donut-shaped houses. It's because they're extraordinarily expensive and not a very good use of space. Do you accept PwC's assertion that because 85% of the cost is contracted, though critically hasn't been spent, and from an engineering perspective could be reversed, do you accept PwC's assertion that therefore we just have to let all of these potential cost savings slide?
So I accept the report, just to be clear, but I do take your point. I'm not willing to concede yet in relation to the potential for cost reduction, because the report does say it's technically possible to reduce costs. So it does say that. It says it in the summary, and it says it on page 75 as well. But it caveats that by saying that if you were to do that, you could cause other difficulties for the project. I mean, I'm summarising now. It talks about you could do a value engineering proposition as you outline, but you could therefore run into difficulties for planning. So, for example, if you change the shape of the building now, as an example, or you could end up delaying the project further, which could cause other costs. So when I met Fred Barry, the new chair of the board, before the PwC report, I did ask him to come back to me with a view in relation to, with a fresh pair of eyes, as to what cost reduction measures could be placed. So what I don't want to do is I don't want to mislead the taxpayer here, and I don't want to suggest that I have a report, because we don't, that says there's significant room for savings. But I do want to talk to Fred Barry, and I do want Fred Barry to, as chair of the board, to prepare a report as to the possibility of it. And I'd like him and his board to engage with you and this committee in that regard as well.
Thank you.
It does, though, say, and just to repeat that at this point once, I mean, it does say, though, that it would be better to spend the energies and efforts and expertise of the board on making sure there aren't further cost rises. So we'll have to balance that.
Thank you.
I don't concede the point, Judge. No.
Just on the maternity hospital. Okay, I'll squeeze both questions in then, if I may, to be a slightly cheeky chair. On the maternity hospital, in a peaky response to me recently enough, you stated broadly that essentially no serious work was underway yet on the maternity hospital, that the design phase hadn't started. Obviously, one of the most important parts of this hospital is co-location at the maternity hospital. Can I ask, is there any provision in the estimates we're looking at to seriously ramp up the design phase and procurement and all the other things, professional services? There's a lot of money has to be spent in beginning to get this maternity hospital moving. Can I ask in the estimates what level of provision you have in there? And final question, which I'll put in at the same time, broadly on the estimates we're looking at. Obviously last year we saw an overrun of about 600 and something million. Relative to today, so what we signed off on in December, how are we doing thus far in the year in terms of our run rate and spending according to the amount that the Dáil has sanctioned? Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks for the question. So the honest answer to your question on the maternity hospital is that there isn't provision in this year's estimates to do that. So there's no point me suggesting that there is. What there is this year, though, is some money for the theatres at the Coombe. We obviously...
Sorry to interrupt you. Do you think that's acceptable, Minister?
I think it'd be highly desirable if we could move ahead with it, but just in terms of the funding priorities and all the discussions we're having about capital, so I just don't want to mislead the committee and suggest that we have funding to do this. Willing to have another look at it as the year progresses. There is no doubt, and there are many sceptics out there, of which I know you are not one, there is no doubt that we are going to build the Coombe on the site of this hospital, and we are going to have tri-location. So I think it would be a good confidence building measure to show a bit of progress on that. I've spoken to the Master of the Coombe about this previously. What we have decided to do this year, in terms of, I suppose, meeting the risks of our current maternity services, is to prioritise some works at the Coombe theatres. But I'll take a look at it, but I don't want to mislead you or the committee and suggest that there's funding in relation to this. Regarding the financial situation of the HSE for this year, so I should just make a couple of points on that. We'll very shortly put in place a new board. You and I are working in relation to that. I think that'll be a key governance control that we've been lacking for a number of years. I think you and I agree on that now as well. We have a new HSE DG CEO appointed who will take office next month. I look forward to this committee having a chance to talk to them. I'll be very clear with them in relation to their budgetary responsibilities. We can't have a repeat of last year, because we just can't get ourselves into that situation again. You can deal with that in one year, you couldn't deal with it in two. While today the HSE is technically on profile, is my understanding, and that's not for me to mislead this committee and suggest that there aren't a number of emerging pressures. You've been commenting on some of them in recent days as well. There is a real need for the HSE to get a pay and number strategy in place so that we can have realistic recruitment plans that match with the budget, and not kind of individual hospital managers or CHOs kind of making their own recruitment decisions. There does have to be a centralised approach to that as well. So both myself and Minister Donnelly are keeping a very close eye on this. We're awaiting the final outturn from 2018, which I think will be audited shortly in relation to the HSE as well, and where that lands will be important. So as of now, we're technically on profile, but I don't say that in any sort of complacent manner.
The forecast for the year, I know we'll know more as the money is actually spent, but is the forecast for the rest of the year, therefore, so far that the estimate is for this year the health budget will come in on profile?
I think we have about 2 months of data so far that suggests that it is currently on profile on forecast, but as I say, there are emerging pressures. Getting the pay and numbers strategy right is a key one. So I'm in no way complacent about this, and there's a lot of hard work going on to make sure that the HSE doesn't have a repeat of last year's performance.
Thanks. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Deputy Donnelly. Now, Deputy Jonathan O'Brien.
Can I just... And I'm slow to do it, Minister, but I think in the interest of fairness, can I just go back to the cervical check issue? Could you outline, maybe based on advice given to you or just as Minister for Health, what would have happened if we didn't offer the free smear tests at that time?
My very clear understanding from hearing from GPs, some of whom I've referenced, and indeed from talking to my officials, was that women were already making the decision to seek the reassurance. So you are going to have a situation very quickly where women were going to end up in their GP surgery looking for reassurance, with a lack of clarity on the GP's part as to what could actually happen, with a two-tier system emerging where women who could afford it could have it. And then also a real risk, and these were, I referenced some of the phrases earlier that I had received, a real risk that you'd actually accidentally further undermine confidence in the programme if you told a woman, well, look, to be honest, you know, we're not sure what's happening with our screening programme, we're waiting for this report to come out in a number of months, and we can't provide you with any repeat smear. You know, the helpline had been set up, and the helpline was beginning to receive lots and lots and lots and lots of phone calls from worried women seeking that reassurance. So I think it would have added to the chaos at the time. I think, quite frankly, in the Dáil, you would have all demanded I do it. You've been honest enough to admit that. I think you all would have been demanding it happen. I think you would have had GPs, and we already had a degree of this. GPs showed huge leadership during this situation, but I think you would have had GPs finding the situation even more confusing in terms of looking for guidance and clarity. Dr. Peter McKenna really stepped up to the plate and provided clinical guidance to our GPs at this time. So I think you would have had many people seek free repeat smears anyway, which would have caused a capacity issue. But you would have had it done in a manner that wasn't uniform, fair, and would have been two-tier. So, I mean, really, what I did was, and this is forgotten, I mean, I introduced a fee to pay the GP to see the woman. And then it was up to the GP and the woman together in consultation to decide whether they believed a repeat smear was required. And that somewhat worked, because a significant number, in around 50% of those consultations, did not result in a repeat smear. You know, it was enough for the woman from her reassurance point of view and for the doctor from having the conversation to actually decide they didn't need it. And in about 50%, the doctor and the woman together decided. And
I presume the doctor, and maybe the chair can help me out in this, in deciding whether to refer a woman for a repeat smear, there would be some medical criteria which would have to be met, I would presume. It's not just a case of a woman needing reassurance and a GP deciding to send her for a repeat smear to reassure her. There would have to be some I think it would be somewhat of a mixture. I mean, this was a reassurance mechanism. Okay. And what I wouldn't do as Minister for Health, and never will do, nor are you asking me to, is put myself in that consultation room. So, I mean, I was trusting women and their doctors together to make what they believed to be an appropriate decision. So I wasn't going to have a situation where some women could access this and others couldn't. I wasn't going to have a situation where a doctor believed it was appropriate and couldn't access it either. So
like I say, this was far from ideal. Like, I wouldn't like anyone to misunderstand my position or my department's. This is never something you'd wish to do. You know, this is something that's meant to be done on a scheduled basis every number of years or in accordance with risk. It's a population kind of health programme. But this was different. This was trying to, you know, people said, and I heard people say it last week, you know, people said you could have undermined the confidence in the screening programme. I would respectfully, very respectfully suggest that happened. That had happened with the failure to disclose. So, like I say, not an ideal situation, not a situation you'd contemplate ever doing in normal times, but, you know, chatting about it a year on from kind of higher ground in terms of, you know, further distance from the debacle isn't a fair reflection of the place we were in.
No, and I think...
You did mention it, Deputy O'Brien. Those conversations with women who were concerned and came to general practitioners were quite complex consultations, and the advice would have been given on the basis of the woman's history, so on her risk profile, and some women are at higher risk than others. Some women will have had several smears in the past, which would reassure that their smears were accurate. So it was, there were quite difficult consultations, and it really came back to the woman's uncertainty. And if they were very uncertain or very worried, they would have been given the smear. But many women just required reassurance that the cervical screening programme was a very effective programme, that it was working properly, that the issue was really around audit rather than, and non-disclosure, rather than any deficiency in this system. But many women did not understand that it was a screening test rather than a diagnostic test, and they expected that the screening test was going to be definitive. And of course, no screening test is definitive. It's a population programme, so it benefits the population. When it comes down to the individual, there will be some individuals who will not be picked up by screening, and that is the issue in all screening. So it was a very complex consultation, and in my experience, if the woman was extremely worried and concerned, they proceeded to a smear. But if they were reassured within the consultation that the programme was working effectively, then they didn't proceed to a smear.
That's a very helpful clarification, because it gives us an insight into what was actually happening.
I think it's important, Minister, because there's this narrative being put out there that because there was a free smear offered to women, that the narrative from where I'm sitting is that everyone took it up. Everyone who went to their GP ended up getting a smear, and we now know it's 50% and 50% didn't. And I think, again, this is a personal opinion, Minister, I think that if you didn't do what you did at that time in real time, given where we were in terms of confidence in the screening programme, I probably would have been calling for your head if you didn't do it. So I don't have an issue with the decision which was taken. As I said, it did have consequences afterwards in terms of the capacity of the system to actually facilitate that. That is regrettable. I also accept that when that decision was made, it had to be made in real times. So, Minister, now I want to give you the opportunity of how we're actually going to address that, because you said earlier that that's where the conversation now needs to be, because we now are in a situation where we need to provide confidence again to women who are waiting for those results, or who are waiting for those, I think it's 80, is it 80,000? So we now need to speak to them directly. We've given them the smear test in terms of reassuring them. We now have a backlog. How are we going to reassure them now in relation to that? What's the next steps?
Yeah, so thanks for providing me with the opportunity to do that. I think that the first thing, just worth saying, I accept that 2/3 of the backlog is made up of out-of-cycle smears where women, as we've gone through the process, decided in consultation with their GP for reassurance to seek another smear. 1/3 of it, 1 in 3, is made up of new women entering the screening programme. And I do just say that as a good thing. We talked about how our screening programme can save lives. The fact that 1 in 3 of the backlog are new women who said, God, after all this discussion about screening, I think I'll get screened, and for the first time ever had a smear test. You see this in other countries too. They saw it in the UK at the time of Jade Goody's. passing as well, when there's a lot of discussion. So I think that is just worth remembering, that a lot of new women came forward, and hopefully some good will come of that. But you're dead right. What are we going to do now? So we have to find extra capacity. Now, this is not something we're saying today or yesterday. This is something that the HSE have been tirelessly working on. I singled out Damien McCallion earlier for leading that effort. Up until very recently, they hadn't been able to say that they'd identified potential extra capacity. That changed last week, where they were able to tell this committee, and indeed tell me, that they have identified potential extra capacity. That doesn't mean we're over the line, and I don't wish to suggest we are. This week they're engaging with that potential extra capacity, looking at quality assurance and all the other negotiations that you have to do. If we can get that over the line, and I can only say if today, if we can get that over the line, my understanding from talking to the HSE is that we will see a significant reduction in the backlog over the summer months, that I would hope by the time we get to the end of the summer months, the end of August or so, if the extra capacity comes on stream, that the backlog will largely have been dealt with. So I'll be back to this committee when I have more news, or indeed the HSE will be on that. But I expect we'll know one way or the other the direction of travel in that regard in the next couple of weeks.
So the next couple of weeks we will have a greater idea of whether we actually can secure that extra capacity.
Yes.
And if we are unable to secure that extra capacity, Minister, because I'm sure that you're not just reliant on that particular capacity which has been identified, if we cannot secure that extra capacity, are we still looking at trying to get that extra capacity elsewhere, or is it we have this potential capacity which we're now exploring and we're not looking outside of that?
No, we're continuing to look and explore every opportunity. And then the other issue that will come into play, and a clinician would explain it much better than I will, but the other issue that will then come into play is the benefit that the introduction of HPV testing will have in reducing the demand on cytology. So there's an interplay there between the introduction of HPV testing and the positive benefit that can have on capacity. So that there are other ways of looking at this, but being very blunt, the most straightforward way is to secure the extra capacity. Like I say, those talks are literally ongoing this week.
Okay. I won't say too much else on the Children's Hospital, but I just do want to, I have been asked to put on the record that the next Residents Monitoring Committee meeting, that there will be a senior official there from the contractor to discuss it with them. I know some of the residents are in, so just to confirm that will happen.
And if I can just say, I had an opportunity with Senator Van to meet some of the residents this morning. There's no way of avoiding the fact that when you live very near a large construction project, that causes upheaval for local residents, and it can cause a lot of difficulty for the local community. I know we all understand that. There is a structure set up, is my understanding, in relation to engagement between the local community, the contractors, etc., etc. I've been advised by some of the local residents that they believe that needs to be refined and improved, and that they believe there needs to be better attendance and more senior attendance from both the contractor and the health service at those meetings. And I've given a commitment to Deputy O'Brien that I'll ask that at the next meeting, which I believe is scheduled either this week or next, that happens.
And if I can now turn to the actual estimates, Minister, there's two areas in particular I'd like to focus on. One is the inclusion health, and one is the palliative care section in terms of the budgets. And first of all, in relation to the inclusion health, it's the issue of drug misuse and the number of referrals for addiction services. First of all, can I say that it's a good thing that we are actually meeting our targets. I think the target last year in terms of the percentage of substance misusers under the age of 18 for whom treatment has commenced, and this is commenced within 1 week following an assessment, was actually at 99%, which is, in effect everyone. The concerns I would have is the waiting times to be assessed. So I think there's two different issues here. I think once somebody gets assessed, they are getting the treatment within a very short period of time. We were meeting all of our targets. I don't see any information, and maybe you can provide it through a note to the committee later if you don't have it now, is the number of people who are seeking assessments and the period of time they're waiting. And I have a particular concern, just based on my own personal knowledge of individuals particularly around opiate addictions, heroin for instance. The targets, we're actually meeting the targets from the time somebody gets assessed to when treatment is starting. I think it's 4 days. That's the target for next year. It was 5 days last year, and we actually did it in 4 days, so we have a new target for this year. My concern is the waiting times to be assessed, and I do have some concerns around that, particularly in relation to heroin use, because I'm sure you're well aware, Minister, if somebody is addicted to an opiate such as heroin, and for whatever reason they have an awakening on that particular day that they want to kick the habit, they cannot be waiting around 3 or 4 weeks for an assessment, because within 3 or 4 days the chances are they're no longer in that frame of mind, and the opportunity is lost. So I wonder if you could give us some indication of what we're doing to try and improve the waiting times to be assessed, rather than from assessment into treatment, which are excellent times.
Yeah, so thank Deputy O'Brien for this, and I know you're a strong advocate in relation to this, and you're right to say that there's been some progress made in terms of the waiting time from referral to assessment, but you're basically asking then what's happening in relation to the assessment to treatment piece. So
yeah, well, even the assessment into treatment piece, I think the waiting times are they're on target. We're actually meeting them. My concern is from referral to assessment. While we are decreasing the waiting times, I do think there's a lot more work can be done in that particular area.
So we in consultation with officials here, we think that the target is still 4 days for this week for the actual referral to assessment, but we're going to clarify it and get a note for you. But we believe that 4 days refers to not just referral, but referral and assessment. But I'll clarify it for you in a note.
And the other one is in relation to the needle exchange programme.
Which programme, sorry?
The needle exchange programme. Yes. Again, a very important public health initiative, Minister. I have, and coupled with the methadone programme, some of the feedback that I'm getting from some of the pharmacies on the ground is that they're actually not continuing with those programmes in some cases, and I wonder if you have any information in relation to that. How does the methadone programme work in partnership with pharmacies? Is it done on a contract basis, and once the contract is up, is it renewed, or is it a year-on-year renewal, or just how is that programme implemented?
Yeah, my understanding is that the contract continues unless somebody resigns from the programme, that it's a contract that continues to roll unless somebody actually opts out of the programme. But I'll get the Deputy a note. I haven't been made aware, as you have, and you're probably better informed than me on this, that I haven't been aware of particular problems emerging. But I'd be happy to discuss them with you.
We have 1 or 2 chemists who are ceasing trading. Okay. And they haven't been replaced in terms of alternatives.
Well, if you want, maybe you could provide me with the geographic area. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
And the last area is just on the National Treatment Purchase Fund.
Yes.
And the funding for next year. And could you give us some indication of how that's actually going to impact on waiting lists?
Yeah, no, very, very pleased to do that. So the National Treatment Purchase Fund has a budget of 75 million for 2019. That's up from last year again. The idea this year is, so we managed to reduce the overall number of people waiting for inpatient day case, hospital operation or hospital procedure to just below the 70,000 in 2018, and the aim is to reduce it to just below 60,000 in 2019. So what we should continue to see this year is reductions in the number of patients overall waiting. What's probably more important, and we never really get to discuss it, is the length of time somebody's waiting. So we're projecting, currently at the start of this year there were 40,200 people waiting over 3 months for operations, which is the Sláinte Care target, I guess, 3 months. We reduced that to 31,000 by the end of the year, and we'll reduce the number of patients waiting longer than 9 months for an operation from 14,900 to 10,000. So basically this year the NTPF funding will pay for 25,000 additional inpatient day case treatments, 5,000 scopes, And a new initiative we're trying this year, or a relatively new initiative, is for the first time in quite a while, the NTPF will be used to fund outpatient appointments, first appointments. So the NTPF will carry out 40,000 outpatient first appointments this year. So by the end of the year, we should see the outpatient list lower than it was at the beginning of the year. We still have an awful lot of work to do, though, in relation to outpatients. I think, though, we're getting into a much better place with inpatient day case. You know, the number of patients now being seen in under 3 months or less for hospital operations is improving all the time. The number of people overall waiting on the list is improving all the time. Outpatients is, being very honest, the big bulk, the overwhelming amount of our waiting lists. This is where the sláinte care stuff starts coming in, because if we're now funding, and I'm not suggesting there's a panacea here, there isn't, but if we're starting to fund GPs over the next 4 years to do more in chronic disease management, that potentially removes people from our outpatient waiting lists. If we're looking at, through the Sláinte Care Integration Fund, you know, new and innovative ways of treating things like, say, ophthalmology, you may be able to take some of that out of the hospital. So there's a lot of work going on. I chaired a meeting last week for a couple of hours, I think it was last week or the week before, in relation to kind of how do we get on top of outpatients. We keep talking about this global figure. We actually need to look at the specialties. You know, ophthalmology is a big part of it. A lot of ophthalmology, if you can actually see someone at the outpatient clinic, you can nearly do a see and treat and be done, rather than putting someone on an outpatient list, getting them seen eventually, then having to go somewhere else for the inpatient procedure, or the day case procedure. So we have a lot more work to do with outpatients, but the NTPF this year, direct answer to your question, it's a budget of 75 million. It'll see the inpatient day case waiting list overall reduced to under 60,000 by the end of the year, and it'll see the reductions I outlined there in times.
Chair, do I have time for one last question?
Yes, Deputy.
Okay. Just one last question, so Ministers, just in relation to obviously the new legislation in relation to abortion. Do we have, I know the last time I saw stats, not all 26 counties were offering that service. I think there was 2, maybe I stand corrected. Could you give us an update on whether there is GPs in every single county now offering the service, and do we have a percentage in relation to the number of GPs who are actually providing the service?
So I'll have to get the Deputy accurate figures, because they're figures that are growing and changing, and I'm pleased they're growing in terms of number of GPs signing up. From my recollection, the last figures that I saw, I get a fortnightly report on this. I'm due a fortnightly report any day now, but the last figures I saw, there's more than 300 GPs now signed up, which is quite a significant increase from where we started. There are some counties that don't still have a GP signed up, but I'll confirm those counties to the committee and to the Deputy. But I'm relatively satisfied as we approach 100 days since we introduced abortion into Ireland, that we now have a situation. Sorry, abortion was always here, but as we legalised and recognised it as a country, that it was a reality. I am satisfied that access is in place, that the helpline is working very well. The website myoptions.ie is working well. The Coombe was one of, I suppose, the last major maternity hospital to come on stream. They did some work and are providing the service now as well. And the general feedback that I'm getting from the HSE is that the system is operating as expected, and there haven't been any particular issues flagged with me in that regard. Obviously, we'll be getting to a point where I'm mandated under the law to lay information before the House after a year of the legislation. So that will be, I suppose, the first opportunity for all of us to have a conversation, and we also obviously put in the law a mandatory statutory review of the legislation. But, you know, we heard a lot of people say there won't be enough GPs. We heard a lot of people say there won't be enough hospitals. The general sense is, thanks to great clinical leadership from the ICGP and others, and from hospital doctors, that actually the services are working well, that women are accessing the services, but there are a small number of counties that don't yet have a GP signed up. Legislation
in regard to exclusion zones?
Yeah, so I expect to have a general scheme before Cabinet this summer, as early as possible this summer. This is a priority for me. Unfortunately, Brexit and other things have obviously dominated a lot of time for a lot of our drafters and the likes, but I still expect to have safe access zone legislation, a general scheme of that, to Cabinet this summer, and I look forward to being back here and interacting with colleagues this year. I think we should aim to pass, and I believe we will, that legislation this year.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy O'Brien. And before I bring in Deputy Durkan, in relation to waiting lists for procedures, and both outpatient and inpatient procedures. What percentage of the reduction is related to validation as opposed to the provision of treatments?
So, it's a good question. So the central waiting list validation, I'm just checking my notes here, was established in June 2018. It's expected that about 30,000 patients, now these are estimates because obviously it's to be a legitimate exercise where you have to decide you don't need the appointment, you had the appointment, but the general estimate is that about 30,000 outpatient appointments will be validated during the course of the year. So the focus this year is largely on outpatients. There is a sense that when you have such a large figure and such inaccurate data and lack of systems and the likes, that there can be duplications, there can be people who were treated in other hospitals and the like. So we did have, and I'll acknowledge this, we did have a kind of very disparate way of doing validation, which I think some GPs were expressing a view that there was an unfairness about it or a lack of uniformity, so we did centralise it in the NTBF. My feedback is that it's working quite well, that largely speaking GPs think it's a fairer system, that GP organisations have been briefed on it and the likes. I'm happy to get you a detailed note on it, but my understanding is about they reckon about 30,000 from the outpatients list is the number that will be validated. Now remember that's 30,000 out of I think 516,000.
So 30,000 have been removed from the outpatient waiting list, or
It's
30,000 have been...
It's an estimate that 30,000 will be removed by the end of the year, but that's subject to people not needing the appointment. So it's not an exact science.
Okay, approximately 30,000 will be removed from the outpatient waiting list by the end of the year through the validation process.
That's an estimate, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Now, Deputy Durkan, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to move to another subject for a moment, I'll come back to the most prominent ones again. Staffing levels throughout the health services at the present time, Mr. Chairman, perhaps the Minister might shed some light on the full extent of staffing levels in the public health sector at the present time, and the extent, if any, to which an embargo, which has been suggested at the moment, is likely to affect that. Which areas are likely to be most affected, or if any, and the exact numbers in terms of an increase in staffing levels over the past 2-3 years.
Yeah, I really welcome the question. So let me be crystal clear. The aim here is not to have to apply a restriction. What seems to be the case here is that the HSE is meant to publish a pay and number strategy each year. How many people will we take on in the health service this year? And I'm pleased to say, as the Deputy hinted, for the last number of years, thankfully, we're back in an area of growth in terms of the numbers. So we're hiring more nurses, we're hiring more doctors, we're hiring more therapists, and we have a job of work to do in that regard. But you can't have a situation. Imagine if the Minister for Education got his budget on a day and it said we're going to hire X number more teachers this year, and then individual schools around the country actually said, sure, we'll take a few more. Then the Department of Education wouldn't live within its budget. It has to be the same in the health service, even though it's a larger organisation. The same principle has to apply. We, the Oireachtas, vote through a budget. The budget says this year we will hire X thousand more staff, and I think that year this roughly is about 2,000 additional approved and funded development posts. So there'll be about an extra 2,000 people working in the health service by the end of the year. Last year we saw the health service increase by over 3,000, and just to give you a flavour, we saw 867 new nurses last year, 175 new therapists, 125 new consultants. So to be very clear, we're growing the size of the health service this year. There will be more nurses, more doctors, more therapists at the end of the year than the start of the year. And that's right and proper, because that's what you voted for when you passed the budget. That's different to saying it's okay for the HSE willy-nilly at a local level to employ whoever they want. They have to actually align with what we want them to do. Otherwise, you'll be back in here asking me, why is the HSE over budget? Or you'll be asking me, how the hell did we appoint all these people in different roles, be they roles that you may not attach the same degree of priority to? So what the HSE seem to have done, and I hadn't seen the letter, nor should I have seen the letter, I don't see every individual letter that's issued by the HSE, but in preparation for the pay and number strategy, what the HSE had done was they'd said to their system, look, if you have a plan in, you can keep on recruiting to your plan, once it's a credible plan, but if you haven't put in a credible plan, and you're not intending to put in a credible plan, you're going to have to pause your recruitment until you put in a credible plan. So I have spoken to the HSE about this over the weekend, because I straight away saw it being portrayed as a moratorium, a ban on recruitment, etc., etc., etc. And the HSE has emphasised to me very clearly and indeed I to them, that the aim is not to apply the restrictions to any hospital group or any community health organisation that has a plan and is living within that plan. But you can't have a situation where Manager X or Manager Y does their own plan, ignorant of the budget that we voted through. So that's where we're at in that regard. Deputy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I ask, in relation to the areas where recruitment has taken place, whether they have been of benefit to those sensitive areas which have shown been under stress over the past number of years? For instance, my colleague, Senator Colm Burke, has raised this issue on a number of occasions, which would seem to suggest that administration comes first and the actual frontline services come afterwards. He says, and I agree, that it should be the other way around. And the question that arises then from that is, who decides where these staffing, extra staff are who decides on the category of staff, and who decides on where they're deployed?
Yeah, so actually achieving exactly what you're suggesting, Deputy, is the purpose of a pay and number strategy, because if you don't have one, the who decides becomes very opaque, and you have individual localised decisions you made. Now, of course, you want to give people individual flexibility, but we have to make sure that the areas in which recruitment is focused are the areas that we, the Oireachtas, and we, the government, have prioritised and want to prioritise. Now, I believe they are. I quoted the number of nurses we'd seen extra in the system last year, 867, therapists 175, consultants an extra 125. We've still a way to go, particularly in relation to the consultant situation as well. But this is a document we publish every year called Health in Ireland Key Trends. And I mean, if you look at the medical dental category, let's just go 20. We can start at any year you want, because it's going up since 2010. But not to go through them all. If you go in 2014, there were 8,817 people in that category. That is now 10,400 as of last year. If you take the nursing category, in 2014, 34,509 nurses, now 37,220. Health and social care professionals, 13,640 in 2014, 16,193 as of last year. So right away the numbers are growing. Now there is often a misrepresentation, I must say, in relation to management and administration grades, because there's often it's an easy thing to do, and I'm not suggesting you're doing it, Deputy, because you didn't, but there can be somewhat of a populist view somewhat put forward that administrators aren't playing these key roles, and often they are. I mean, the person who is booking the appointments in the hospital, or the person who's working with the consultant, is making sure that a patient actually gets seen, might be classified as an administrator. If we're having the doctor and the nurse answering the telephone instead of somebody else, that's a waste of their skill as a healthcare professional. Indeed, and I say this in good humour, partial to an odd PQ yourself as well, they all need to obviously be answered by people who might fall into that grade as well. So making sure there is. Now, having said all of that, if you ask me my honest view is that we need to slim down the management of the HSE, and we do that through the Sláinte Care programme that you put in place through geo-alignment, where instead of having dual management structures, one for a hospital group and one for a community health organisation, you end up with one. But the pay and number strategy is about exactly that. It's about making sure that there's a clear understanding from all of us of what we as taxpayers are getting in terms of extra recruitment and for the extra investment we put into the system.
The Minister did answer the question, but he might come back to it again maybe. The areas that have shown the most stress over the past number of years, and incidentally, waiting lists, are not a new phenomenon in this country. I have been around for a few years, involved in the health services as well, in a previous incarnation. And I can remember the same questions coming up year after year. I can remember the same constituents coming in to talk to me while waiting 2, 3, 4, and 5 years for hip operations and various other operations, notwithstanding the pain the patient was suffering and so on. So it's not true to say, that this is a new phenomenon. It's not. And neither is the expenditure overruns a new phenomenon. They've been going on for as long as I'm around. Every year, to a greater or lesser extent, depending on circumstances at the time. But it is not true to say that these issues have not arisen before. It most certainly is not. The point I would emphasise there is that when I was raising the question, I'm trying to find out, who deploys the staff to the areas in such a way as to deal with the sensitive and overloaded areas. For example, I talk to a lot of medical professionals, and they all have their own opinions. Like, I have my opinion about the HSE itself is fairly well known at this stage. I'm not going to go into that particular rant at the moment. There will be another day for that, I have no doubt about it, as time goes on. But the point that's been brought to my attention is this, that the professional will tell you on a regular basis that there are particular areas where there's a severe stress arising from shortage of staff in dealing with the day-to-day running of the health services, and it doesn't seem to get the same attention as they would like. And my question there is, are they right or are they wrong?
Yeah, I think this is. I mean, I think this is a challenge in general, and what we're trying to do, Deputy Durkan, and what I suppose I'm doing more and more of, is each year as we allocate the budget, identify what the development posts are. So not just say to the health service, you know, here's your 16 or 17 billion for the year, come back with a plan. We're trying to be, and this is not about being, you know, adversarial, it's more about being collaborative and working with them to agree what are the priority areas. So for example, this year, one of the areas we've decided is that there's a real pressure point in relation to therapists, particularly therapies for children. So this year we've taken a decision to hire 100 additional therapists into the system. So that then goes out as an understanding that must be, before I can approve the service plan, included in the service plan. Now, when you're dealing with an organisation as large in terms of staff, obviously I'm not, nor should my department be deciding the individual nursing numbers in each, and nor are you suggesting in each hospital. But we're trying to identify those pinch points that you rightly identify across the system and incrementally address them budget on budget, with some success in some areas and with other areas where there remains to be work to be done.
By way of parliamentary question, I've tried from time to time to ascertain, as the year progresses, from the very first quarter to the second quarter to the third quarter, the extent to which the budgetary provisions are seen to meet the requirements or the demand. And that question now I have repeated for several years, going back to over numerous governments. And for some unknown reason, it doesn't seem to be possible to identify precisely the extent, if any, of an overrun until a time when there has to be drastic measures have to be taken, either by way of cutting services or by way of increasing the supplementary budget.
Yes, I think there's really two parts to that. I think the first is the governance structures that we have in the health service in general, which the Swanick Committee, I think, unanimously decided were inadequate, which is a view that I gave when I came to that committee as well. And that's why I've worked hard to put in place a board. You could argue that HSE's had a board before, that would be factually correct, but a different type of board in terms of, I don't mean this in a disparaging way towards former boards, but, you know, getting the right skill sets. Indeed, this committee had a view that I didn't get them fully right and wants me to put clinicians on and the like. So we're working our way through that to get a robust, competence-based board, which I expect to take office at the start of June as well. So we have to get those governance structures right, but we also have to, we have to, through the accountability structures, make sure that when the money leaves the Department of Health, or indeed the HSE, that it's spent appropriately locally. You can't have a situation where one hospital group works really hard to try and come in on budget, another blows their budget, and then the good performing hospital is expected to kind of somewhat compensate for that. You have to reward good behaviour. So the idea of, again under geo-alignment, the idea of putting in the regional board structure will give a greater layer of oversight, so that not every question has to come to the Minister of the day or indeed to the Oireachtas before there's sight on the issue. I think there needs to be greater scrutiny. I know you were, and I think you are, a strong advocate of the health board structure, and I would suggest that the new model that we're proposing under Sláinte Care is the best of both worlds, that you would have a strong, slimmed down national centre working on what it should be, but more devolved to the regions with better regional oversight, so that exactly what the Deputy says, you don't hear in, September, the HSE has overshot its budget by X hundred million, and that there are the early warning signs and the ways of working your way through it, both at an individual, kind of local level, individual hospital level, and at a national level.
Deputy, yes.
Yeah, the problem, Chairman, is this, that when the time comes to take action to curtail expenditure, usually it's in a very sensitive area that has the maximum impact and a public outcry, whereas earlier action would have the effect of ensuring that, first of all, that we didn't have that glitch at the sensitive time, and secondly, that there would be more scope to rearrange funds, for want of a better description, in order to meet the oncoming challenges.
Yeah, but I think it's. I mean, you can't have a situation whereby. So first, I suppose the first point I'd make is overruns are not consequence-free, right? Even if the taxpayer, in times of buoyant tax receipts, can find the money to deal with it, as we could this year, that's money we could have spent somewhere else otherwise, right? So it's not consequence-free, is the first point I'd make. And the second point is you can't, you know, the first area shouldn't always be the politically sensitive or the patient-sensitive area. And I'm certainly not around anywhere as long as you don't have the experience that you have, Deputy Durkan. But I do share your viewpoint in taking a healthy scepticism to what is often presented as the appropriate course of action if that arises.
Two last points, Chairman, to make. First of all, the reassurance of the women throughout the country in relation to the cervical tests. Are we satisfied now that adequate provision has been made to ensure that we don't arrive at this juncture again? That adequate provision is put in place to be able to say, hand on heart, that the women won't find themselves stressed out. I know that the best intentions always apply and doesn't always happen, but within reason, can we say to ourselves, we can reassure women that everything is put in place now that can humanly be done to address the issues that have caused concern and have caused serious issues, including death, as a result of a failure to identify a particular issue on time. And that includes in relation to, as we know, these issues have ended up in court, and the courts have made decisions. So these things shouldn't be happening. And the follow-up to that question is simply this. I have asked this question before. I have come to the conclusion that a great deal of time and energy, and more particularly expenditure, is now going into addressing the legal issues. That doesn't really address the health issue at all. In actual fact, addressing the health issue in the first instance doesn't require litigation. And so the question I'm asking is this. What kind of level of expenditure are we talking about? How much money is being spent on litigation at the present time? Defending cases of one kind or another. And I know there will always be a certain amount of that. There's always a certain amount of that. But if we come to a situation where an inordinate amount of money is being spent on legal fees, we have to ask the question, we're in the business of providing health services, not legal services.
Thank you. So those two last questions.
They're not the two last ones. There's one still there to go. I added that one in the middle there because I'm a very patient man, but I wait for everything.
Last year. Okay, so just so the answer to your last question, Deputy Durkan, is €360 million is budgeted this year for the State Claims Agency. Now, of course, that's not, nor are you suggesting all legal fees, but that's the estimate for the State Claims Agency this year. We are, as a government, doing a number of things to try and address this and reduce it. So open disclosure is actually one, because we all know that, and Dr. Scally talks about this quite passionately and with conviction and experience, that often, an early admission that a mistake was made and a genuine apology and learnings is often what a lot of us want as citizens, but all too often have found that we have to go down an adversarial route to get the answers. So that's
increasing?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It's 320 in 2018. Second issue is we have introduced periodic payments through the Department of Justice again to try and ensure that often when people go to court, they don't want a massive lump sum. They want to know that they can care for themselves or their loved one from an adverse incident in a kind of orderly manner. The third one we're doing, which is a big body of work that I think the Department of Justice are leading on, but we're contributing to, and it's chaired by Justice Meenan, is a look at tort reform in this whole area in general. Why does medical negligence need to be so adversarial? Are there better ways of doing it? Now, you've seen an element of that in relation to the cervical check piece of work and the tribunal legislation we'll bring forward for that. But there's a broader piece of work there as well, so I don't disagree with what you say. In relation to the broader issue of how can we provide women with assurances that lessons have been learned from what went wrong in relation to the non-disclosure from an audit and cervical check, I think you made the point earlier and I'll just reiterate it. I mean, obviously screening is not a diagnostic tool. There are always false positives, there are always false negatives in any screening service. At the very heart of this debacle, though, was the issue of non-disclosure. Disclosure was meant to happen, so it's not a case of whether disclosure is a good or a bad idea. It was agreed that disclosure would happen, and then something went clearly very wrong. What I would say to the women of Ireland, and indeed to their families, is we do now have in the Scally report key recommendations that will fulfil what I believe to be Vicky Phelan's ambition when she first spoke to me to say she wanted some good to come of this. We will eradicate cervical cancer within a generation. I'm determined we'll do that. My department's determined we'll do that. Doctors are determined we'll do that. And we'll do it through vaccination. We'll do it through a really robust screening programme. We can effectively eradicate this awful disease. And the Scally report is so detailed in its recommendations. People are working very hard on its recommendations. I asked Dr. Scally to stay around to oversee the progress, and he just produced his first progress report a couple of weeks ago, and he noted very good progress. And he also, encouragingly, was praiseworthy of my own department and the HSE in terms of the seriousness with which they were taking the recommendations.
Thank you. And your last question, Deputy?
The last question is in relation to a point that's been made by a number of speakers, is the question about the design of the Children's Hospital being oval shaped or whatever, that being the most expensive kind of structure to provide. That's not necessarily the case. It depends on the curvature of the particular building. If it's a tight curve, it costs more that way already, quite a lot more. But if it's the larger the building, the less extra costs likely to be incurred, for the simple reason is it is a more gradual curve. So I hate to impart any knowledge. Usually I ask questions, but just for the benefit of the wider multitudes, all of whom have left, have gone home, I think, now at this stage, and probably are now issuing the press statement that goes along with the conclusions. So I throw that in there, Mr. Chairman, just to alert them to the fact that we're watching that too. Some of us are.
I think that was a comment rather than a question, but always an informed one.
Minister, could I just address three issues before we finish? The bed capacity review of last year indicated that if there was substantial health reform implemented over the next 10 years, we would need 2,600 beds. If there wasn't substantial health reform introduced over the next 10 years, we could need up to 8,000 beds. The figure is probably somewhere in between. And obviously there is unmet need in the system through the trolley count, which is a crude measure, but nevertheless indicates the lack of bed capacity in our waiting lists and in unmet need. So when can we see new beds, new build beds being developed over the next 10 years? And in addition to that, Sláintecare suggested that we should have elective-only hospitals, and my understanding from the Sláintecare implementation strategy and the Sláintecare implementation plan is that the choice of location and the design of those hospitals won't be available until 2021. Is that perhaps that's not accurate? You can clarify it in your answer. But the issue is when are we going to see the expansion in bed capacity in relation to our unmet need? The second one is in relation to approximately 450 consultant vacancies in the system at the moment, and that is undoubtedly leading to a delay in service provision and again leading to unmet need. And pay disparity between consultants appointed pre and post 2012 is a factor in that. Working conditions also is a factor, but it is a huge problem in relation to the delivery of service. And the final question in relation to primary care services. It is very welcome that the Department and the IMO have come to an agreement in relation to restoration of funding to general practice. But it still leaves the issue of many communities being left without a GP when a GP resigns. And the issue is most acute in rural areas, but it is also in urban areas and in our county towns. So can the Minister speak about guaranteeing a community that they will have a primary care service independent of market forces? Because quite often it's market forces that dictates whether a GP is replaced or not when one retires or resigns. And there is a proposal which I presented to you maybe last year in relation to a fellowship programme, which UL in particular is proposing that when a practice becomes available but can't attract a candidate, that the graduates from that university or that training scheme, GP training scheme, would rotate through a practice, sharing perhaps their work with a commitment to hospital medicine and also a commitment to research, so that young GPs can supply service to a community who can't attract a GP. They can maintain their university connections, and they can also do research. And there is a proposal that a fellowship programme between the university and the HSE could provide services to a community that can't attract a GP. So perhaps you might just comment on those 3 items. Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks very much, Chairman. So the bed capacity. So we are beginning to roll out additional bed capacity already. You asked when will kind of new capacity open in terms of new build, new extensions. 40 in Clonmel due to open this year. I think I just don't have the figure in front of me. I think there's about 50 in Drogheda due to open. The 60 in UHL are obviously underway as well. And when we publish our capacity plan shortly. Our capital plan shortly, that will show how we endeavour to roll that out further over the coming 2 to 3 years. On the elective-only hospital sites, I bow to your knowledge on this, but I would not be satisfied with not selecting sites until then. My understanding was that sites will be selected this year, but I'll check that and revert to the Deputy. There is a bigger body of work to do, as my department keep explaining to me, as opposed to just picking the site, which is what are you going to put into the elective-only hospital, and that does vary from country to country. So I visited Scotland recently, saw what they've done there, but they even have an ICU at their elective-only hospital. So the services you provide has a bearing, as you know, on the site. I know you'll get a comprehensive briefing on Sláintreacha this afternoon. I think you make a fair point about the vacancies in consultants. Of course, we have seen, I need to state this, but it's important, we have seen the number of consultants rise in the system, but we do have very many vacant consultant posts, and it is a cause of concern for me. I've been meeting recently with a number of consultants. I've met with the IHCA as well. I've met with the IMO. I've met and discussed it with individual consultants. The Public Service Pay Commission does say that there should be a process in place in relation to dealing with the whole issue of consultant pay, and I'll be working my way through that with colleagues in terms of how best government should respond to that. On the issue of GPs, I welcome your welcome for the restoration of funding to general practice. I will have a look again at that fellowship programme. Myself and my department will revert to you on your suggestion, and we thank you for it. I would just make an initial point that we have in the agreement with the IMO, we have agreed to increase the rural allowance by 10% from next year, and for the first time ever establish an urban deprivation fund, which I know is something you'd spoken to me about before from the deep end group. I think it made the point about the inverse relationship between the availability of health services and the health needs of a community. It's a €2 million fund for that for this year and every other year. We now need to work out how to spend that, as in what's the best way to actually utilise that. So I'll come back to you on the fellowship programme idea, though.
Thank you very much, Minister. Now, Deputy Donnelly, you have one short question, maybe?
Thanks, Chair. Well, one short, or do I have a few minutes, or do you want me to keep it very short?
You have a few minutes.
Short.
Yeah,
great. Thank you. Minister, on consultants and GP pay, we very much welcome the FEMPI reversal, which was one of the things that Fianna Fáil pushed hard for in the budget negotiations, and very much welcome that is happening. There's another huge area where we have pay discrepancy for new entrant consultants, where potentially consultants with the same level of qualification, it just so happens one worked abroad for a few years, is coming back in and potentially being paid €70,000 less. It's been identified as one of the big reasons why we're finding it so hard to recruit back consultants who we've trained up in this country, or indeed new foreign consultants in. And we have the lowest number of consultants per population in Europe. It's a major, major issue. Can I ask, within the estimates we're seeing, is there any provision, or is there any thinking towards including a provision to unwind or begin unwinding that new entrant pay discrepancy, so that we can begin hiring the consultants we badly need in the country?
I welcome your welcome, and I know your commitment in relation to general practice as well, and I'm pleased we could collectively make some progress on this. In relation to the issue of consultants, I'm going to be blunt here. I believe there is an issue here. How we resolve it is what requires government's collective thinking now. The Public Service Pay Commission was clear that there should be a process, I'm quoting from my memory now, but that there should be a process in place to look at this issue. The decision is not mine alone, but I intend to engage with government more broadly on this in the coming weeks to see how we respond to that. I have had some useful meetings recently, as I said to the chairman there, with the IHCA, with the IMO, and with individual consultants. So I can't go further than that today, other than to. So there isn't, as I think you know, there isn't no, because there has to be there isn't an agreement in terms of, this would be a new agreement in relation to pay.
Well, just on that. So the GP contract essentially includes the reversal of FMP. That was provisioned for in the anticipation that the unwinding would begin this year. So there is provisioning, to the best of my knowledge, in the budget as it's in these estimates for that. But just to clarify, there's no provisioning in here for any unwinding with consultants.
Yeah, in our vote, because new entry pay is dealt with centrally by government, so it's generally dealt with through the central vote and deeper. But no, there isn't.
Provisioning would still be in this budget, wouldn't it? It's consultant pay.
Not necessarily. The new entrants could be dealt with centrally. But look, to answer your question, no, there isn't. That's the point you're getting to. So we dealt with, in fairness, we've dealt with GPs in terms of their issues. I hope we've dealt with them. It's a matter for them to decide. We made good progress in relation to the restoration issue and other things. I accept that the consultants is the next big issue from a HR perspective and the staffing of our health service. And it'll be getting my full focus in the coming weeks.
Thank you. Can I ask, the Chair has asked you several questions about Sláinte Care.
Yeah.
From memory, the Sláinte Care report estimates that the year one requirement is, I think it was around 600 or 700 million euro, and the actual activity related specifically to Sláinte Care, as opposed to things that were happening whether Sláinte Care existed or not, is about 20 million. Can I ask, do you and does your department at this stage broadly accept the Sláinte Care figures of year one, 600-700 million euro ramping up? Do you accept the broad estimate of several billion for the transition fund? Or have you indeed done your own analysis and have you your own profile? Yeah. And do you accept on this that the 20 million for this year, regardless of what the right figure is or the department's figure is way below what's needed to really launch Sláinte Care properly? Yeah.
So two parts to that question. I think you know I don't accept that there's 20 million on Sláinte Care this year. There's 20 million in the Sláinte Care Integration Fund, but I won't rerun my view from my opening statement. But even the 27 million for the GP contract this year is clearly Sláinte Care. The GP and the DPS and prescription charges are directly from Sláinte Care in the budget. So we have the figure of over 200 million this year for Sláinte Care. I know there's a briefing later on it where you can scrutinise that, but that's the figure we have. I accept the Sláinte Care plan. What I don't accept and have never accepted is the sequencing of it, and I not to speak for you, but I doubt you would either. So if I had followed the Sláinte Care plan, I'm not sure, I don't speak for the chairman either, but I'm not sure he would have on this one either. If I accepted the Sláinte Care plan's sequencing, I would have introduced free GP care for another 500,000 people this year, which obviously would have come at a considerable cost, but it would have collapsed general practice, quite frankly, without dealing with how to fund general practice. So what we have done through the work of Laura McGahey is I suppose, try to sequence, in my view, what is, in a better way, the aim of Sláinte Care.
Do you have costings attached to that revised sequencing? Yeah,
we do. So I do accept, just to be clear, I do accept the overall cost estimate of the Sláinte Care report over a 10-year period. Okay. What I don't accept is the sequencing, because to be quite frank, even the ramping up period of time that it actually takes wasn't, in my view, taken into consideration. So the Sláinte Care report, excellent report, fully accept where it wants to get us to. It wasn't an operation or an implementation plan, in my view. So we did a lot of work to detail it. We published our response to it last year, and now we've published year one of the implementation plan this year. So we do have costings. Some of the costings, I think you'll understand, whilst we can brief you on and talk to you about them, we can't crystallise them publicly. There's some big things. So if we decide, let's just take for example, one of the big recommendations of Swanick, which I support, and not everyone does, is taking private practice out of public hospitals. I've commissioned the Donald de Butler report. I now have that report. I have to deliberate on it and bring it to Cabinet in due course. The cost of, for example, that may result in very significant negotiations, and the likes need to happen. So it's hard to crystallise all of the costs. But broadly speaking, I don't disagree with the cost of Swanick. I just do disagree with the sequencing of it.
Okay, but I guess the question I'm asking is, regardless of the sequencing of it, is the year one, year two, year three, etc., costs required, because we have to provision for them. Can you provide the committee with an overall envelope of spend per year you think is required to deliver Sláintecare, so that we can look at that relative to what the Sláintecare report itself believes?
Yeah, I'm happy to provide you with all that I have. There'll be areas that on Sláintecare, there'll be areas that I don't have the level of specificity because I can't, pending kind of negotiations or big policy decisions that we have to make as an Oireachtas.
One minor question, Minister, and I've just one quick one after this, Chair. Thank you for the ability to come back in. I was just contacted by a lot of people today on a very specific issue, which is the drug Spinraza. Yes. Now, a lot of people obviously were very disappointed at the decision not to proceed at the current price. Can I ask, within the estimates, is there any provision? This is what I'm being asked. Is there any provision within the estimates we're considering today for Spinraza to be made available at some point this year?
So yeah, so I'd like to answer the question specifically on Spinraza. So what we don't do when we provide a drugs budget any year is say at the start of the year, these are all the drugs we'll provide, for obvious reasons. As new drugs come on stream, negotiations go on, etc., etc. What I'd like to say is I hope we can make Spinraza available. The legal responsibility lies with the HSE. My understanding, and I know there's a lot of parents very nervous about this and very anxious and stressed, my understanding is that the company has now submitted, it's from my memory, Deputy, I don't have my note with me on it, but has now submitted a revised offer to the HSE, and that's currently being considered, and that I'd hope we'll have news on that shortly. But I'm happy to come back to you in writing today or tomorrow on that, Deputy.
And Chair, I'll just finish where I started, if I may. I want to thank the Minister for providing the email regarding the advice from Cervical Check to the Department on the offer of the 3 out-of-cycle test. It makes for very interesting reading, in that it, as you say, details a lot of the risks and indeed predicts a lot of what happened. Can I just ask, when the decision was made at Cabinet the following Tuesday, was this email made available to the Cabinet?
No, nor was it available to me.
It wasn't available to you?
No, and this is not, just to be very clear,
yeah,
because it's not a criticism of my officials. I believe they behaved entirely appropriate in how they dealt with this, and indeed showed great leadership. The email wasn't made available to me or the Cabinet, and the reason it wasn't made available to me, or not that it wasn't made available, the reason it wasn't passed on to me, is that my officials believed all of the risks outlined in that were risks that were readily identifiable to them, and that there was nothing in this that was new to them. They knew the risks associated with this, that they believed that it was still the appropriate action to take, and again that the email did point out that it was a matter for my department to make the decision, and the email came post the decision and post the announcement of the decision.
Just out of curiosity, when were you made aware of the National Screening Service's concerns?
I think I became aware in kind of February of this year, in recent weeks or months.
So your officials never told you that the people running the programme advised in the strongest possible terms that the offer of the free test could, quote, fundamentally undermine the system and lead to these delays? So
these concerns became available post the decision being made. I was taking the advice directly from my officials, who were at this stage effectively stepping into the breach, and these concerns weren't passed on to me. But I quite frankly believe it's somewhat irrelevant whether they were or they weren't, because I believe the decision was right based on the advice I had from my officials and the time that we were in. All of the risks in this are similar to risks that you've been outlining in recent weeks. Indeed, I've outlined the content of this email to you, I think, as far back as March. So I'm satisfied that my officials' explanation that there was nothing in this that they hadn't already identified was appropriate. These were readily identifiable risks.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Deputy. Just, Minister, in relation to sequencing and Sláinte care, I think when you read the report which outlines universal primary care and expanding universal primary care to the entire population, which is one of the foundation recommendations of Sláinte care, there is in the report that capacity or expansion of eligibility and expansion of services cannot take place until there is adequate GP manpower on the ground to deliver it. So, yes, it recommended a rollout of 500,000 per year, but only once capacity was available within general practice. And what we're talking about is whole-time equivalents. We know the number of GPs that are on the Medical Council register and who have a GMS contract. They may not all be whole-time equivalents. So the issue in relation to capacity is the number of whole-time equivalent GPs who are delivering a service within the system. And as you're aware, a significant number of practices are not taking on any new patients now because they cannot deliver the service. So for safety reasons, they have closed their lists. The agreement that you've come to with the IMO in restoration of funding may not necessarily deal with the manpower issue. So if you're going to deliver free care to different cohorts of people under 8s, 10s and 12s, you have to ensure that the capacity is there to deliver it. So Sláinte care, yes, spoke about delivering 500,000 new patients to free GP care each year, but only provided that the capacity was there. And there hasn't been any move to increase GP capacity. I think that's the point I would make.
So I didn't mean to be, and I hope it didn't come across, I didn't mean to be critical of the Sláinte care plan. I just made the point that in that sense, it's a little, if you were to be negative, a little contradictory, because it's saying you must do this in year one, but then later on it's saying you only can do it when. So I thought we needed to kind of make it more programmatic, and that's the work Laura McGahey's been doing. I do hope, though, and I accept we've more to do on this, but I do hope that the measures we've agreed with GPs will help the capacity and the manpower issue. Like, if we are significantly restoring fees, also going beyond that, and it's for the IMO and the NAGP to outline that, but also going beyond that, increasing the rural allowance, putting an urban deprivation in place, providing funding for 247, I think, whole-time equivalent practice nurses. You would hope that this will make general practice a more attractive career choice now and into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. So I think that concludes. Thank you very much, Deputy Durkan. You can send them. I'm sure the Minister will communicate with you directly. Minister, thank you very much for coming in this morning to discuss the estimates. Deputy Breslin, Secretary General Breslin, and Assistant Secretary Colm Desmond. So, as we have now completed our consideration of the 2019 further revised estimates for vote 38, the Clerk will send a message to that effect to the Clerk of the Dáil in accordance with Standing Order 90. Under Standing Order 89.2, the message is deemed to be the report of the committee. This meeting is now adjourned until Wednesday, the 17th of April at 9 a.m. Where we will take the committee stage of the Health and Social Care Professional Amendment Bill 2018, which is also a select committee. This committee is now adjourned. Sine die.